Knecht informed his friend Ferramante of Plinio's confession with deep emotion, and Ferramante himself added in the letter we have just cited, "To me, as a musician, this confession of Plinio, to whom I had not always been entirely fair, was like a musical experience. The contrast of world and mind, or of Plinio and Joseph, had before my eyes been transfigured from the conflict of two irreconcilable principles into a double concerto." When Plinio had come to the end of his 4-year course and was about to return home, he brought the headmaster a letter from his father, inviting Joseph Knecht to spend the coming vacation with him. This was an unusual proposal. Leaves for journeys and stays outside the pedagogic province did exist, chiefly for purposes of study. They were not so very rare, but were exceptional and generally granted only to older and more seasoned researchers, never to younger students still at school. But since the invitation had come from so highly esteemed a family and personage, Headmaster Zbinden did not presume to reject it on his own, but presented it to a committee of the Board of Educators. The reply was a laconic refusal. The friends had to say goodbye to each other. "We'll try the invitation again sometime," Plinio said. "Sooner or later it will work out. You must someday see my home and meet my family, and realize that we are not just commercial-minded scum. I shall miss you very much. And make sure, Joseph, that you rise quickly in this complicated Castalia of yours. Of course, you're highly suited to become a member of the hierarchy, but in my opinion more at the top than the bottom of the heap, in spite of your name. I prophesy a great future for you. One of these days you'll be a magister, and be counted among the illustrious." Joseph gave him a sad look. "Go ahead and make fun of me," he said, struggling with the emotion of parting. "I am not so ambitious as you, and if I should ever attain to some office, you will long since have become president or mayor, university professor or deputy. Think kindly of us, Plinio, and of Castalia. Don't become entirely estranged from us. After all, there have to be a few people in the outside world who know more about Castalia than the jokes they make about us out there." They shook hands, and Plinio departed. For his last year in Waldsell, Joseph remained out of the limelight. His exposed and strenuous function as a more or less public personality had suddenly come to an end. Castalia no longer needed a defender. Joseph devoted his free time during that year chiefly to the Glass Bead Game, which enthralled him more and more. A notebook of jottings from that period, dealing with the meaning and theory of the game, begins with the sentence, "The whole of both physical and mental life is a dynamic phenomenon, of which the Glass Bead Game basically comprehends only the aesthetic side, and does so predominantly as an image of rhythmic processes." Chapter 3. Years of Freedom. Joseph Knecht was about 24 years old at this time. With graduation from Waldsell, his school days were over, and there now began his years of free study. With the exception of his uneventful boyhood in Eschholz, these were probably the most serene and happy years of his life. There is, after all, always something wonderful and touchingly beautiful about a young man, for the first time released from the bonds of schooling, making his first ventures toward the infinite horizons of the mind. At this point he has not yet seen any of his illusions dissipated, or doubted either his own capacity for endless dedication or the boundlessness of the world of thought. Especially for young men with gifts like those of Joseph Knecht, who have not been driven by a single talent to concentrate on a specialty, but whose nature rather aims at integration, synthesis, and universality, this springtide of free study is often a period of intense happiness and very nearly of intoxication. Were it not preceded by the discipline of the elite schools, by the psychic hygiene of meditation exercises, and the lenient supervision of the Board of Educators, this freedom would even be dangerous for such natures, and might prove a nemesis to many, as it used to be to innumerable highly gifted young men in the ages before our present educational pattern was set, in the pre-Castalian centuries. The universities in those days literally swarmed with young Faustian spirits who embarked with all sails set upon the high seas of learning and academic freedom, and ran aground on all the shoals of untrammeled dilettantism. Faust himself, after all, was the prototype of brilliant amateurishness and its consequent tragedy. In Castalia, as it happens, the intellectual freedom of the student is infinitely greater than it ever was at the universities of earlier ages, since the available materials and opportunities for study are far ampler. Moreover, studies in Castalia are in no way restricted or colored by material considerations, by ambition, timidity, straitened circumstances of the parents, prospects for livelihood and career, and so on. In the academies, seminars, libraries, archives, and laboratories of the pedagogic province, every student is completely equal, no matter what his origins and prospects. The hierarchy grades the student solely by his qualities of mind and character. On the other hand, most of the freedoms, temptations, and dangers to which so many talented youths succumb at the secular universities simply do not exist in Castalia. Not that there is a dearth of danger, passion, and bedazzlement there. How could these elements ever be completely absent from human life? But at least certain opportunities for going off the rails, for disappointment and disaster, have been eliminated. There is no danger of the Castalian student's becoming a drinker, nor can he waste the years of his youth in tomfoolery or the empty braggadocio of secret societies, as did some generations of students in olden times. Nor is he apt to make the discovery some day that his degree was a mistake, that there are gaps in his preparatory education which can never be filled. The Castalian order of things protect him against such blunders. The danger of wasting himself on women or on losing himself in sports is also minimal. As far as women are concerned, the Castalian student is not subject to the temptations and dangers of marriage, nor is he oppressed by the prudery of a good many past eras which imposed continence on students, or else made them turn to more or less venal and sluttish women. Since there is no marriage for the Castalians, love is not governed by a morality directed toward marriage. Since the Castalian has no money and virtually no property, he also cannot purchase love. It is customary in the province for the daughters of the citizenry not to marry early, and in the years before marriage they look upon students and scholars as particularly desirable lovers. The young men, for their part, are not interested in birth and fortune, are prone to grant at least equal importance to mental and emotional capacities, are usually endowed with imagination and humor, and, since they have no money, must make their repayment by giving more of themselves than others would. In Castalia, the sweetheart of a student does not ask herself, "Will he marry me?" She knows he will not. Actually, there have been occasions when he did. Every so often an elite student would return to the world by way of marriage, giving up Castalia and membership in the order. But these few rare cases of apostasy in the history of the schools and of the order amount to little more than a curiosity. After graduation from the preparatory schools, the elite student truly enjoys a remarkable degree of freedom and self-determination in choosing among the fields of knowledge and research. Unless a student's own talents and interests dictate natural bounds from the start, the only limit on this freedom is his obligation to present a plan of study for each semester. The authorities oversee the execution of this plan in only the mildest way. For young men of versatile talents and interests, and Knecht was one of these, the scope thus allowed him is wonderfully enticing and a source of continual delight. The authorities permit such students, if they do not drift into sheer idleness, almost paradisiacal freedom. The student may dabble in all sorts of fields, combine the widest variety of subjects, fall in love with 6 or 8 disciplines simultaneously, or confine himself to a narrower selection from the beginning. Aside from observing the general rules of morality that apply to the whole province and the order, nothing is asked of him except presentation once a year of the record of the lectures he has attended, the books he has read, and the research he has undertaken at the various institutes. His performance comes in for closer check only when he attends technical courses and seminars, including courses in the Glass Bead Game and at the Conservatory of Music. Here, every student has to take the official examinations and write the papers or do the work required by the head of the seminar, as is only natural. But no one forces him to take such courses. For semesters or for years he may, if he pleases, merely make use of the libraries and listen to lectures. Students who take a long while before deciding upon a single field of knowledge thereby delay their admission into the order, but the authorities show great patience in allowing and even encouraging their explorations of all possible disciplines and types of study. Aside from good moral conduct, nothing is required of them except the composition of a life every year. It is to this old and much mocked custom that we owe the 3 Lives by Knecht, written during his years of free study. These were, then, not a purely voluntary and unofficial, not to say secret and more or less illicit kind of literary activity, such as his poems written at Waldsell had been, but a normal and official assignment. Far back in the earliest days of the pedagogic province, the custom had arisen of requiring the younger students, those who had not yet been admitted to the order, to compose from time to time a special kind of essay or stylistic exercise which was called a life. It was to be a fictitious autobiography, set in any period of the past the writer chose. The student's assignment was to transpose himself back to the surroundings, culture, and intellectual climate of any earlier era, and to imagine himself living a suitable life in that period. Depending on the times and the fashion, Imperial Rome, 17th century France, or 15th century Italy might be the period most favored, or Periclean Athens, or Austria in the time of Mozart. Among language specialists, it had become the custom to compose their imaginary biographies in the language of the country and the style of the period in which they were best versed. Thus, there had been highly ingenious lives written in the style of the papal curia at Rome around the year 1200, in monastic Latin, in the Italian of the Cento Novelle Antiche, in the French of Montaigne, and the Baroque German of Martin Opitz. A remnant of the ancient Asian doctrine of reincarnation and the transmigration of souls survived in this playful, highly flexible form. All teachers and students were familiar with the concept that their present existence might have been preceded by others, in other bodies at other times, under other conditions. To be sure, they did not believe this in any strict sense. There was no element of dogma in the idea. Rather, it was an exercise, a game for the imaginative faculties to conceive of oneself in different conditions and surroundings. In writing such lives, students made a stab at a cautious penetration of past cultures, times, and countries, just as they did in many seminars on stylistics, and in the Glass Bead Game as well. They learned to regard their own persons as masks, as the transitory garb of an entelechy. The custom of writing such lives had its charm, and a good many solid benefits as well, or it probably would not have endured for so long. Incidentally, there was a rather considerable number of students who not only more or less believed in the idea of reincarnation, but also in the truth of their own fictional lives. Thus, the majority of these imaginary pre-existences were not merely stylistic exercises and historical studies, but also creations of wishful thinking and exalted self-portraits. The authors cast themselves as the characters they longed to become. They portrayed their dream and their ideal. Furthermore, from the pedagogic point of view, the lives were not a bad idea at all. They provided a legitimate channel for the creative urge of youth. Although serious, creative literary work had been frowned on for generations and replaced partly by scholarship, partly by the Glass Bead Game, youth's artistic impulse had not been crushed. In these lives, which were often elaborated into small novels, it found a permissible means of expression. What is more, while writing these lives, some of the authors took their first steps into the land of self-knowledge. Incidentally, the students frequently used their lives for critical and revolutionary outbursts on the contemporary world and on Castalia. The teachers usually regarded such sallies with understanding benevolence. In addition, these lives were extremely revealing to the teachers during those periods in which the students enjoyed maximum freedom and were subject to no close supervision. The compositions often provided astonishingly clear insight into the intellectual and moral state of the authors. 3 such lives written by Joseph Knecht have been preserved. We intend to reproduce their full text and regard them as possibly the most valuable part of our book. There is much room for conjecture as to whether he wrote only these 3 lives, or whether there might have been others which have been lost. All we know definitely is that after Knecht handed in his 3rd Indian life, the Secretariat of the Board of Educators suggested that if he wrote any additional lives, he ought to set them in an era historically closer to the present and more richly documented, and that he should pay more attention to historical detail. We know from anecdotes and letters that he thereupon actually engaged in preliminary research for a life set in the 18th century. He cast himself as a Swabian pastor, who subsequently turned from the service of the church to music, who had been a disciple of Johann Albrecht Bengel, a friend of Oettinger, and for a while a guest of Zinzendorf's congregation of Moravian brethren. We know that he was reading and taking notes on a quantity of old and often out-of-the-way books on church organization, pietism, and Zinzendorf, as well as on the liturgy and church music of the period. We know also that he was fascinated with Oettinger, the charismatic prelate, and that he felt genuine love and veneration for Magister Bengel. He went to some pains to have a photograph made of Bengel's portrait, and for a while had the picture standing on his desk. He also honestly tried to write an account of Zinzendorf, who both intrigued and repelled him. But in the end he dropped this project, content with what he had learned from it. He declared that he had lost the capacity for making a life out of these materials through having studied the subject from too many angles and accumulated too many details. In view of this statement, we may justifiably regard the 3 lives he did complete rather as the creations of a poetic spirit than the works of a scholar. In saying this, we do not think we are doing them any injustice. In addition to the freedom of the student at last permitted to range at will in self-chosen studies, Knecht now enjoyed a different kind of freedom and relaxation. He had not, after all, been merely a student like all the others. He had not only submitted to the strict training, the exacting schedules, the careful supervision and scrutiny of the teachers, in a word, to all the rigor of elite schooling. For along with all that, because of his relationship to Plinio, he had borne the far greater strain of a responsibility which had in part spurred him to the utmost of his potentialities, in part drawn heavily on his energies. In assuming the role of public advocate of Castalia, he had taken on a responsibility that was really too much for his years and his strength. He had run grave risks, and succeeded only by applying excessive willpower and talent. In fact, without the music master's powerful assistance from afar, he would not have been able to carry his assignment to its conclusion. At the end of those unusual years at Waldsell, we find him, a young man of 24, mature beyond his age, and somewhat overstrained, but amazingly bearing no visible traces of damage. But the degree to which his whole nature had been taxed and brought to the verge of exhaustion is apparent, although there is no direct documentation for it, from the way he employed the first few years of that freedom he had at last attained, and for which he had no doubt deeply yearned. Having stood in so conspicuous a position during his last years at school, he immediately and completely withdrew from the public eye. Indeed, when we seek the traces of his life at that time, we have the impression that if he could, he would have made himself invisible. No surroundings and no societies seemed undemanding enough for him, no mode of living private enough. For example, he replied curtly and reluctantly to several long and tempestuous letters from Designori, then ceased to answer altogether. The famous student Knecht vanished and could no longer be located, but in Waldsee his fame continued to flower, and in time became almost a legend. At the beginning of his years of free study, he avoided Waldsee for the reasons given. This meant that for the time being he eschewed the graduate and postgraduate courses in the Glass Bead Game. But although, to the superficial observer, Knecht was ostentatiously neglecting the game, we know that, on the contrary, the entire seemingly wayward and disconnected, and certainly altogether unusual course of his studies had been influenced by the Glass Bead Game, and led back to it and to the service of the game. We mean to discuss this somewhat at length, for this trait was characteristic. Joseph Knecht employed his freedom for study in the strangest and most idiosyncratic fashion, the one that revealed an astonishing youthful genius. During his years at Waldsee he had, as was usual, taken the official introduction to the Glass Bead Game and the review course as well. During his last school year, and among his friends, he already had the reputation of being an excellent player. But then he was gripped with such a passion for this game of games that after completing another course, and while still in school, he had been admitted to a course for players of the second stage, which was a very rare distinction indeed. Some years later he told his friend and later assistant, Fritz Tegularius, who had at school taken the review course along with him, of an experience which not only decided his destiny as a Glass Bead Game player, but also greatly influenced the course of his studies. The letter is extant. The passage runs, "Let me remind you of the time the two of us, assigned to the same group, were so eagerly working on our first sketches for Glass Bead Games. Do you recall a certain day and a certain game? Our group leader had given us various suggestions and proposed all sorts of themes for us to choose from. We had just arrived at the delicate transition from astronomy, mathematics, and physics to the sciences of language and history, and the leader was a virtuoso in the art of setting traps for eager beginners like us, and luring us on to the thin ice of impermissible abstractions and analogies. He would slip into our hands tempting baubles taken from etymology and comparative linguistics, and enjoyed seeing us grab them and come to grief. We counted Greek quantities until we were worn out, only to feel the rug pulled out from under us when he suddenly confronted us with the possibility, in fact the necessity, of accentual instead of a quantitative scansion, and so on. In formal terms, he did his job brilliantly and quite properly, although I did not like the spirit of it. He showed us false trails and lured us into faulty conjectures, partly with the good intention of familiarizing us with the perils, but also a little in order to laugh at us for being such stupid boys, and to instill a heavy dose of skepticism into those of us who were most enthusiastic about the game. And yet, as things turned out, it happened under his instruction and in the course of one of his complicated trick experiments — we were timidly and awkwardly trying to sketch a halfway decent game problem — that I was all at once seized by the meaning and the greatness of our game, and was shaken by it to the core of my being. We were picking apart a problem in linguistic history, and, as it were, examining close up the peak period of glory in the history of a language. In minutes we had traced the path which had taken it several centuries, and I was powerfully gripped by the vision of transitoriness, the way before our eyes such a complex, ancient, venerable organism, slowly built up over many generations, reaches its highest point, which already contains the germ of decay, and the whole intelligently articulated structure begins to droop, to degenerate, to totter toward its doom. And at the same time the thought abruptly shot through me, with a joyful, startled amazement, that despite the decay and death of that language, it had not been lost, that its youth, maturity, and downfall were preserved in our memory, in our knowledge of it and its history, and would survive, and could at any time be reconstructed in the symbols and formulas of scholarship as well as in the recondite formulations of the Glass Bead Game. I suddenly realized that in the language, or at any rate in the spirit of the Glass Bead Game, everything actually was all meaningful, that every symbol and combination of symbols led not hither and yon, not to single examples, experiments, and proofs, but into the center, the mystery and innermost heart of the world, into primal knowledge. Every transition from major to minor in a sonata, every transformation of a myth or a religious cult, every classical or artistic formulation was, I realized in that flashing moment, if seen with a truly meditative mind, nothing but a direct route into the interior of the cosmic mystery, where in the alternation between inhaling and exhaling, between heaven and earth, between yin and yang, holiness is forever being created. Of course, by that time, I had attended many a well-constructed and well-executed game. Listening, I had often been exalted and overjoyed by the insights such games afforded. But up to that time I had repeatedly been inclined to doubt the real value and importance of the game. After all, every neatly solved problem in mathematics could provide intellectual pleasure. Every good piece of music could exalt and expand the soul toward universality when heard, and even more when played. And every reverent meditation could soothe the heart and tune it to harmony with the universe. But perhaps for that very reason, my doubts whispered, the glass bead game was merely a formal art, a clever skill, a witty combination, so that it would be better not to play this game, but to occupy oneself with uncontaminated mathematics and good music. But now, for the first time, I had heard the inner voice of the game itself, its meaning. It had reached me and penetrated me, and since that moment I have believed that our royal game is truly a lingua sacra, a sacred and divine language. You will remember, for you remarked on it yourself at the time, that a change had taken place within me. A summons had come to me. I can compare it only to that unforgettable call which once lifted my heart and transformed my life, when as a boy I was tested by the Magister Musicae and summoned to Castalia. You noticed it. I felt that at the time, although you said not a word about it. Let us say no more about it today. But now I have something to ask you, and in order to explain my request, I must tell you something that no one else knows or is to know. That my seemingly disorganized studies at the present time are not the result of whim, but of a definite underlying plan. You will recall, at least in general outline, the glass bead game exercise we constructed at that time, as pupils in the third course, and with the leader's assistance, in the course of which I heard that voice and experienced my vocation as a lusor. That game began with a rhythmic analysis of a fugal theme, and in the center of it was a sentence attributed to Confucius. Now I am studying that entire game from beginning to end. That is, I am working through each of its phrases, translating it from the language of the game back into its original language, into mathematics, ornament, Chinese, Greek, and so on. At least this once in my life, I intend to restudy and reconstruct systematically the entire content of a glass bead game. I have already finished the first part, and it has taken me 2 years. Of course, it is going to cost me quite a few years more. But since we are granted our famous freedom of study in Castalia, this is how I mean to use it. I am familiar with the objections to such a procedure. Most of our teachers would say, "We have devoted several centuries to inventing and elaborating the glass bead game as a universal language and method for expressing all intellectual concepts and all artistic values and reducing them to a common denominator. Now you come along and want to check over everything to see if it is correct. That will take you a lifetime, and you will regret it." Well, I shall not take a lifetime, and I hope I won't regret it. And now for my request. Since at present you are working in the game archives, and I, for special reasons, prefer to keep away from Waldsell for a good while longer, I hope you will answer quite a barrage of questions for me every so often. That is, I shall be asking you to send me from the archives the unabbreviated forms of the official clefs and symbols for all sorts of themes. I am counting on you, and counting on your asking reciprocal favors as soon as there is anything I can do for you." Perhaps this is the place to cite that other passage from Knecht's letters, which also deals with the glass bead game, although the letter in question, addressed to the music master, was written at least a year or two later. "I imagine," Knecht wrote to his patron, "that one can be an excellent glass bead game player, even a virtuoso, and perhaps even a thoroughly competent Magister Ludi, without having any inkling of the real mystery of the game and its ultimate meaning. It might even be that one who does guess or know the truth might prove a greater danger to the game, were he to become a specialist in the game or a game leader. For the dark interior, the esoterics of the game, points down into the one and all, into those depths where the eternal Atman eternally breathes in and out, sufficient unto itself. One who had experienced the ultimate meaning of the game within himself would by that fact no longer be a player. He would no longer dwell in the world of multiplicity, and would no longer be able to delight in invention, construction, and combination, since he would know altogether different joys and raptures. Because I think I have come close to the meaning of the glass bead game, it will be better for me and for others if I do not make the game my profession, but instead shift to music." The music master, who usually confined his correspondence to a minimum, was evidently troubled by these remarks, and replied with a rather lengthy piece of friendly admonition. "It is good that you yourself do not require a master of the game to be an esoteric in your sense of the word, for I hope you wrote that without irony. A game master or teacher who is primarily concerned with being close enough to the innermost meaning would be a very bad teacher. To be candid, I myself, for example, have never in my life said a word to my pupils about the meaning of music. If there is one, it does not need my explanations. On the other, I have always made a great point of having my pupils count their eighths and sixteenths nicely. Whatever you become, teacher, scholar, or musician, have respect for the meaning, but do not imagine that it can be taught. Once upon a time, the philosophers of history ruined half of world history with their efforts to teach such meaning. They inaugurated the age of the feuilleton, and are partly to blame for quantities of spilled blood. If I were introducing pupils to Homer or Greek tragedy, say, I would also not try to tell them that the poetry is one of the manifestations of the divine, but would endeavor to make the poetry accessible to them by imparting a precise knowledge of its linguistic and metrical strategies. The task of the teacher and scholar is to study means, cultivate tradition, and preserve the purity of methods, not to deal in incommunicable experiences which are reserved to the elect, who often enough pay a high price for this privilege. There is no other mention of the glass bead game and its esoteric aspect in all the rest of Knecht's correspondence of that period. Indeed, he does not seem to have written many letters, or else some of them have been lost. At any rate, the largest and best-preserved correspondence, that with Ferramante, deals almost entirely with problems of music and musical stylistic analysis. Thus there was a special meaning and resolution behind the peculiar zigzag course of Knecht's studies, which consisted in nothing less than the circumstantial retracing and prolonged analysis of a single game pattern. In order to assimilate the contents of this one pattern, which the schoolboys had composed as an exercise within a few days, and which could be read off in a quarter hour in the language of the glass bead game, he spent year after year sitting in lecture halls and libraries, studying Froberger and Alessandro Scarlatti, fugues and sonata form, reviewing mathematics, learning Chinese, working through a system of tonal figuration and the Feustelian theory of the correspondence between the scale of colors and the musical keys. We may ask why he had chosen this toilsome, eccentric, and above all lonely path, for his ultimate goal, outside of Castalia, people would say, his choice of profession, was undoubtedly the glass bead game. He might freely have entered one of the institutes of the Vicus Lusorum, the settlement of glass bead game players in Waldsell, as a guest scholar. In that case, all the special studies connected with the game would have been made easier for him. Advice and information on all questions of detail would have been available to him at any time, and in addition he could have pursued his studies among other scholars in the same field, young men with the same devotion to the game, instead of struggling alone in a state that often amounted to voluntary banishment. Be that as it may, he went his own way. We suspect that he avoided Waldsell partly to expunge as far as possible from his own mind and the minds of others the memory of his role as a student there, partly so that he would not stumble into a similar role among the community of glass bead game players. For he probably bore away the feeling from those early days that he was predestined to become a leader and spokesman, and he did all that he could to outwit the obtrusiveness of fate. He sensed in advance the weight of responsibility. He could already feel it toward his fellow students from Waldsell, who went on adulating him even though he withdrew from them. And he felt it especially toward Tegularius, who would go through fire and water for him. This he knew instinctively. Therefore he sought seclusion and contemplation, while his destiny tried to propel him forward into the public realm. It is in these terms that we imagine his state of mind at the time. But there was another important factor that deterred him from taking the usual courses at the higher glass bead game academies and made an outsider of him. That was an inexorable urge toward research arising from his former doubts about the glass bead game. To be sure, he had once tasted the experience that the game could be played in a supreme and sacred sense. But he had also seen that the majority of players and students of the game, and even some of the leaders and teachers, by no means shared that lofty and sacramental feeling for the game. They did not regard the game language as a lingua sacra, but more as an ingenious kind of stenography. They practiced the game as an interesting or amusing specialty, an intellectual sport, or an arena for ambition. In fact, as his letter to the music master shows, he already sensed that the search for ultimate meaning does not necessarily determine the quality of the player, that its superficial aspects were also essential to the game, that it comprised technique, science, and social institution. In short, he had doubts and divided feelings. The game was a vital question for him, had become the chief problem of his life, and he was by no means disposed to let well-meaning spiritual guides ease his struggles, or benignly smiling teachers dismiss them as trivial. Naturally, he could have made any one of the tens of thousands of recorded glass bead games and the millions of possible games the basis of his studies. He knew this, and therefore proceeded from that chance game plan that he and his schoolmates had composed in an elementary course. It was the game in which he had for the first time grasped the meaning of all glass bead games and experienced his vocation as a player. During those years he kept with him at all times an outline of that game, noted down in the usual shorthand. In the symbols, ciphers, signatures, and abbreviations of the game language, an astronomical formula, the principles of form underlying an old sonata, an utterance of Confucius, and so on, were written down. A reader who chanced to be ignorant of the glass bead game might imagine such a game pattern as rather similar to the pattern of a chess game, except that the significances of the pieces and the potentialities of their relationships to one another and their effect upon one another multiplied many-fold, and an actual content must be ascribed to each piece, each constellation, each chess move, of which this move, configuration, and so on is the symbol. Knecht's studies went beyond the task of acquainting himself in the utmost detail with the contents, principles, books, and systems contained in the game plan, and retracing as he went away back through various cultures, sciences, languages, arts, and centuries. He had also set himself the task that none of his teachers even recognized, of employing these objects to check in detail the systems and possibilities of expression in the art of the glass bead game. To anticipate his results. Here and there he found a gap, an inadequacy, but on the whole, our glass bead game withstood his stringent reassessment. Otherwise he would not have returned to it at the end of his work. If we were writing a study in cultural history, a good many of the places and scenes of Knecht's student days would certainly merit description. As far as possible, he preferred places where he could work alone, or with only a very few others, and to some of these places he retained a lifelong grateful attachment. He frequently stayed in Montport, sometimes as the music master's guest, sometimes as a participant in a musicological seminar. Twice we find him in Hirschland, the headquarters of the order, as a participant in the Great Exercise, the 12-day period of fasting and meditation. He used later to tell his intimates with special affection about the bamboo grove, the lovely hermitage which was the scene of his I Ching studies. There he learned and experienced things of crucial importance. There, too, guided by a wonderful premonition or providence, he found unique surroundings and an extraordinary person, the founder and inmate of the Chinese hermitage, who was called Elder Brother. We think it proper to describe at greater length this most remarkable episode in his years of free study. Knecht had begun his studies of the Chinese language and classics in the famous Far Eastern College, which for generations had been affiliated to St. Urban's, the academic complex devoted to classical philology. There he had made rapid progress in reading and writing, and also struck up friendships with several of the Chinese working there, and had learned a number of the odes of the I Ching by heart. In the second year of his stay, he turned to a more and more intense study of the I Ching, the Book of Changes. The Chinese provided him with all sorts of information, but no introductory course. There was no teacher available in the college, and after Knecht had repeatedly petitioned them for an instructor for a thorough study of the I Ching, he was told about Elder Brother and his hermitage. It had become apparent to Knecht that his interest in the Book of Changes was leading him into a field which the teachers at the college preferred to keep at a distance, and he therefore grew more cautious in his inquiries. Now, as he made efforts to obtain further information about this legendary Elder Brother, it became obvious to him that the hermit enjoyed a measure of respect, and indeed a degree of fame, but more as an eccentric loner than as a scholar. Knecht sensed that he would have to help himself. He finished a paper he had begun for a seminar as quickly as possible, and took his leave. On foot he made his way to the region in which the mysterious man, perhaps a sage and master, perhaps a fool, had long ago established his bamboo grove. He had gathered a few bits of information about the hermit. Some 25 years before, the man had been the most promising student in the Chinese department. He seemed to have been born for these studies, outdid his best teachers, both Chinese by birth and Westerners, in the technique of brush writing and the deciphering of ancient texts, but became somewhat notorious for the zeal with which he also tried to make himself into a Chinese in outward matters also. Thus he obstinately refused to address his superiors, from the instructor of a seminar to the masters, by their titles, as all other students did. Instead, he called them "my elder brother," until at last this appellation became attached to himself as a nickname. He devoted special attention to the oracular game of the I Ching, and developed a masterly skill at practicing it with the traditional yarrow stalks. Along with the ancient commentaries on the Book of Changes, his favorite book was the philosophical work of Chuang Tzu. Evidently, the rationalistic, somewhat anti-mystical, and declaredly Confucian spirit of the Chinese department of the college, as Knecht encountered it, had already been prevalent at that time. For one day Elder Brother left the institute, which would gladly have kept him as a teacher, and set out on a walking tour, armed with brush, Chinese ink saucer, and 2 or 3 books. He made his way to the southern part of the country, turning up here and there to visit for a while with brethren of the order. He looked for and finally found the suitable spot for the hermitage he planned, stubbornly bombarded both the secular authorities and the order with written and oral petitions, until they granted him the right to settle there and cultivate the area. Ever since, he had been living in an idyllic retreat, strictly governed by ancient Chinese principles. Some referred to him with amusement as a crank. Others venerated him as a kind of saint. But apparently he was content with himself and at peace with the world, devoting his days to meditation and the copying of ancient scrolls whenever he was not occupied with his bamboo grove, which sheltered from the north wind a carefully laid-out Chinese miniature garden. Joseph Knecht, then, tramped toward this hermitage, making frequent stops to rest, delighting in the landscape that lay smiling beneath him as soon as he had climbed through the mountain passes, stretching southward in a blue haze, with sunlit terraced vineyards, brown stone walls alive with lizards, stately chestnut groves, a piquant mingling of southland and high mountain country. It was late afternoon when he reached the bamboo grove. He entered and looked with astonishment upon a Chinese pavilion set in the midst of a curious garden, with a splashing fountain fed by a wooden pipe. The overflow ran along a gravel bed into a masonry basin, in whose crevices all sorts of green plants flourished. A few goldfish swam around in the still crystalline water. Fragile and peaceful, the feathery crowns of the bamboos swayed on their strong, slender shafts. The sward was punctuated by stone slabs carved with inscriptions in the classical style. A frail man, dressed in tan linen, glasses over blue eyes that bore a tentative look, straightened up from a flower bed over which he had been bending and slowly approached the visitor. His manner was not unfriendly, but it had that somewhat awkward shyness rather common among solitaries and recluses. He looked inquiringly at Knecht and waited for what he had to say. With some embarrassment, Knecht spoke the Chinese words he had already formulated. The young disciple takes the liberty of paying his respects to elder brother. The well-bred guest is welcome, elder brother said. May a young colleague always be welcome to a bowl of tea and a little agreeable conversation, and a bed for the night may be found for him if this is desired. Knecht kowtowed, expressed his thanks, and was led into the pavilion and served tea. Then he was shown the garden, the carved slabs, the pond, the goldfish, and was even told the age of the fish. Until supper-time they sat under the swaying bamboos, exchanging courtesies, verses from odes, and sayings from the classical writers. They looked at the flowers and took pleasure in the fading pinks of sunset along the mountain ranges. Then they re-entered the house. Elder brother served bread and fruit, cooked an excellent pancake for each of them on a tiny stove, and after they had eaten, he asked in German the purpose of his visit, and in German Knecht explained why he had come and what he desired, which was to stay as long as elder brother permitted him, and to become his disciple. "We shall discuss that tomorrow," the hermit said, and showed his guest to a bed. Next morning, Knecht sat down by the goldfish pool and gazed into the cool, small world of darkness and light and magically shimmering colors, where the bodies of the golden fish glided in the dark greenish blueness and inky blackness. Now and then, just when the entire world seemed enchanted, asleep forever in a dreamy spell, the fish would dart with a supple and yet alarming movement, like flashes of crystal and gold, through the somnolent darkness. He looked down, becoming more and more absorbed, daydreaming rather than meditating, and was not conscious when elder brother stepped softly out of the house, paused, and stood for a long time watching his bemused guest. When Knecht at last shook off his abstraction and stood up, he was no longer there, but his voice soon called from inside an invitation to tea. They greeted each other briefly, drank tea, and sat listening in the matutinal stillness to the sound of the small jet of water from the fountain, a melody of eternity. Then the hermit stood up, busied himself here and there about the irregularly shaped room, now and then glancing, blinking rapidly, at Knecht. Suddenly he asked, "Are you ready to don your shoes and continue your journeying?" Knecht hesitated. Then he said, "If it must be so, I am ready." "And if it should chance that you stay here a little while, are you ready to be obedient, and to keep as still as a goldfish?" Again Knecht said he was ready. "It is well," elder brother said. "Now I shall lay the stalks and consult the oracle." While Knecht sat and looked on with an awe equal to his curiosity, keeping as still as a goldfish, elder brother fetched from a wooden beaker, which was rather a kind of quiver, a handful of sticks. These were the yarrow stalks. He counted them out carefully, returned one part of the bundle to the vessel, laid a stalk aside, divided the rest into 2 equal bundles, kept one in his left hand, and with the sensitive fingertips of his right hand took tiny little clusters from the pack in his left. He counted these and laid them aside until only a few stalks remained. These he held between 2 fingers of his left hand. After thus reducing one bundle by ritual counting to a few stalks, he followed the same procedure with the other bundle. He laid the counted stalks to one side, then went through both bundles again, one after the other, counting, clamping small remnants of bundles between 2 fingers. His fingers performed all this with economical motions and quiet agility. It looked like an occult game of skill governed by strict rules, practiced thousands of times and brought to a high degree of virtuoso dexterity. After he had gone through the same process several times, 3 small bundles remained. From the number of stalks in them, he read an ideograph which he drew with a tapering brush on a small piece of paper. Now the whole complicated procedure began anew. The sticks were divided again into 2 equal bundles, counted, laid aside, thrust between fingers, until in the end again 3 tiny bundles remained, which resulted in a second ideograph. Moved about like dancers, making very soft, dry clicks, the stalks came together, changed places, formed bundles, were separated, were counted anew. They shifted positions rhythmically, with a ghostly sureness. At the end of each process, an ideograph was written, until finally the positive and negative symbols stood in 6 lines, one above the other. The stalks were gathered up and carefully replaced in their container. The sage sat cross-legged on the floor of reed matting, for a long time silently examining the result of the augury on the sheet of paper. "It is the sign Mong," he said. "This sign bears the name Youthful Folly. Above the mountain, below the water, above Jen, below Kan. At the foot of the fountain the spring bubbles forth, the symbol of youth. The verdict reads, Youthful folly wins success. I do not seek the young fool seeks me. At the first oracle I give knowledge. If he asks again, it is importunity. If he importunes, I give no knowledge. Perseverance is beneficial." Knecht had been holding his breath from sheer suspense. In the ensuing silence he involuntarily gave a deep sigh of relief. He did not dare to ask, but he thought he had understood. The young fool had turned up. He would be permitted to stay. Even while he was still enthralled by the sublime marionette's dance of fingers and sticks, which he had watched for so long, and which looked so persuasively meaningful, the result took hold of him. The oracle had spoken. It had decided in his favor. We would not have described this episode in such detail if Knecht himself had not so frequently related it to his friends with a certain relish. Now we shall return to our scholarly account. Knecht remained at the bamboo grove for months and learned to manipulate the yarrow stalks almost as well as his teacher. The latter spent an hour a day with him, practicing counting the sticks, imparting the grammar and symbolism of the oracular language, and drilling him in writing and memorizing the 64 signs. He read to Knecht from ancient commentaries, and every so often, on particularly good days, told him a story by Chuang Tzu. For the rest, the disciple learned to tend the garden, wash the brushes, and prepare the Chinese ink. He also learned to make soup and tea, gather brushwood, observe the weather, and handle the Chinese calendar. But his rare attempts to introduce the glass bead game and music into their sparing conversations yielded no results whatsoever. They seemed to fall upon deaf ears, or else were turned aside with a forbearing smile, or a proverb such as, "Dense clouds, no rain," or "Nobility is without flaw." But when Knecht had a small clavichord sent from Montport and spent an hour a day playing, elder brother made no objection. Once Knecht confessed to his teacher that he wished to learn enough to be able to incorporate the system of the I Ching into the glass bead game. Elder brother laughed. "Go ahead and try," he exclaimed. "You'll see how it turns out. Anyone can create a pretty little bamboo garden in the world, but I doubt that the gardener would succeed in incorporating the world in his bamboo grove." But enough of this. We shall mention only the one further fact that some years later, when Knecht was already a highly respected personage in Walsall and invited elder brother to give a course there, he received no answer. Afterward, Joseph Knecht described the months he lived in the bamboo grove as an unusually happy time. He also frequently referred to it as the beginning of my awakening. And in fact, from that period on, the image of awakening turns up more and more often in his remarks, with a meaning similar to, although not quite the same as, that he had formerly attributed to the image of vocation. It could be assumed that the awakening signified knowledge of himself, and of the place he occupied within the Castalian and the general human order of things. But it seems to us that the accent increasingly shifts toward self-knowledge in the sense that, from the beginning of his awakening, Knecht came closer and closer to a sense of his special, unique position and destiny, while at the same time the concepts and categories of the traditional hierarchy of the world and of the special Castalian hierarchy became for him more and more relative matters. His Chinese studies were far from concluded during his stay in the bamboo grove. They continued, and Knecht made particular efforts to acquire a knowledge of ancient Chinese music. Everywhere in the older Chinese writers he encountered praise of music as one of the primal sources of all order, morality, beauty, and health. This broad, ethical view of music was familiar to him from of old, for the music master could be regarded as the very embodiment of it. Without ever forsaking the fundamental plan of his studies, which, as we have seen, he outlined in his letter to Fritz Tegularius, he pushed forward energetically on a broad front wherever he scented an element of essential value to himself, that is to say, wherever the path of awakening, on which he had already set out, seemed to lead him. One of the positive results of his period of apprenticeship with elder brother was that he overcame his resistance against returning to Walsall. Henceforth he participated in one of the advanced courses there every year, and without quite realizing how it had happened, he became a personage regarded with interest and esteem in the Vicus Lusorum. He belonged to that central and most sensitive organ of the entire game organization, that anonymous group of players of proven worth in whose hands lay the destinies of the game at any given time, or at least the type of play that happened to be in fashion. Officials of the game institutes belonged to but did not dominate this group, which usually met in several remote, quiet rooms of the game archives. There the members beguiled their time with critical studies of the game, championing the inclusion of new subject areas, or arguing for their exclusion, debating for or against certain constantly shifting tastes in regard to the form, the procedures, the sporting aspects of the glass bead game. Everyone who made a place for himself in this group was a virtuoso of the game. Each knew to a hair the talents and peculiarities of all the others. The atmosphere was like that in the corridors of a government ministry or an aristocratic club where the rulers and those who will take over their responsibilities in the near future meet and get to know one another. A muted, polished tone prevailed in this group. Its members were ambitious without showing it, keen-eyed and critical to excess. Many in Castalia, and some in the rest of the country outside the province, regarded this elite as the ultimate flower of Castalian tradition, the cream of an exclusive intellectual aristocracy, and a good many youths dreamed for years of some day belonging to it themselves. To others, however, this select circle of candidates for the higher reaches in the hierarchy of the glass bead game seemed odious and debased. A clique of haughty idlers, brilliant but spoiled geniuses who lacked all feeling for life and reality, an arrogant and fundamentally parasitic company of dandies and climbers who had made a silly game, a sterile self-indulgence of the mind, their vocation and the content of their life. Knecht was untouched by either of these attitudes. It did not matter to him whether he figured in student gossip as some sort of phenomenon or as a parvenu and climber. What was important to him were his studies, all of which now centered around the game. Another preoccupation was, perhaps, that one question of whether the game really was the supreme achievement of Castalia and worth devoting one's life to. For even as he was familiarizing himself with the ever more recondite mysteries of the game's laws and potentialities, even as he became more and more at home in the labyrinths of the archives and the complex inner world of the game's symbolism, his doubts had by no means been silenced. He had already learned by experience that faith and doubt belong together, that they govern each other like inhaling and exhaling, and that his very advances in all aspects of the game's microcosm naturally sharpened his eyes to all the dubiousness of the game. For a little while, perhaps, the idol in the bamboo grove had reassured him, or perhaps one might say, confused him. The example of elder brother had shown him that there were ways of escaping from this dubiousness. It was possible, for example, as that recluse had done, to turn oneself into a Chinese, shut oneself off behind a garden hedge, and live in a self-sufficient and beautiful kind of perfection. One might also become a Pythagorean or a monk and scholastic. But these were still escapes, renunciations of universality possible and permissible only to a few. They involved renunciation of the present and the future in favor of something perfect enough, but past. Knecht had sensed in good time that this type of escape was not the way for him. But what then was the way for him? Aside from his great talent for music and for the glass bead game, he was aware of still other forces within himself, a certain inner independence, a self-reliance which by no means barred him or hampered him from serving, but demanded of him that he serve only the highest master. And this strength, this independence, this self-reliance, was not just a trait in his character. It was not just interned and effective only upon himself. It also affected the outside world. As early as his years at school, and especially during the period of his contest with Plinio de Signori, Joseph Knecht had often noticed that many schoolmates his own age, but even more the younger boys, liked him, sought his friendship, and moreover tended to let him dominate them. They asked him for advice, put themselves under his influence. Ever since, this experience had been repeated frequently. It had its pleasant and flattering side. It satisfied ambition and strengthened self-confidence. But it also had another, a dark and terrifying side. For there was something bad and unpalatable about the attitude one took toward these schoolmates so eager for advice, guidance, and an example, about the impulse to despise them for their lack of self-reliance and dignity, and about the occasional secret temptation to make them, at least in thought, into obedient slaves. Moreover, during the time with Plinio, He had had a taste of the responsibility, strain, and psychological burden which is the price paid for every brilliant and publicly representative position. He knew also that the music master sometimes felt weighed down by his own position. It was lovely and tempting to exert power over men and to shine before others, but power also had its perditions and perils. History, after all, consisted of an unbroken succession of rulers, leaders, bosses, and commanders, who, with extremely rare exceptions, had all begun well and ended badly. All of them, at least so they said, had striven for power for the sake of the good. Afterward, they had become obsessed and numbed by power, and loved it for its own sake. What he must do was to sanctify and make wholesome the power nature had bestowed on him by placing it in the service of the hierarchy. This was something he had always taken for granted. But where was his rightful place? Where would his energies be put to best use and bear fruit? The capacity to attract and more or less to influence others, especially those younger than himself, would of course have been useful to an army officer or a politician. But in Castalia there was no place for such occupations. Here these qualities were useful only to the teacher and educator, but Knecht felt hardly drawn to such work. If it had been a question of his own desires alone, he would have preferred the life of the independent scholar to all others, or else that of a glass bead game player. And in reaching this conclusion, he once more faced the old tormenting question: was this game really the highest, really the sovereign in the realm of the intellect? Was it not, in spite of everything and every one, in the end merely a game after all? Did it really merit full devotion, lifelong service? Generations ago this famous game had begun as a kind of substitute for art, and for many it was gradually developing into a kind of religion, allowing highly trained intellects to indulge in contemplation, edification, and devotional exercises. Obviously, the old conflict between aesthetics and ethics was going on in Knecht. The question never fully expressed, but likewise never entirely suppressed, was the very one that had now and then erupted, dark and threatening, from beneath the surface of the schoolboy poems he had written in Walsall. That question was addressed not just to the glass bead game, but to Castalia as a whole. There was a period when this whole complex of problems troubled him so deeply that he was always dreaming of debates with Designori. And one day, as he was strolling across one of the spacious courtyards of the Walsall players' village, he heard someone behind him calling his name. The voice sounded very familiar, although he did not recognize it at once. When he turned around, he saw a tall young man with a trim beard rushing tempestuously toward him. It was Plinio, and with a surge of affection and warm memories, Joseph greeted him heartily. They arranged to meet that evening. Plinio, who had long ago finished his studies at the universities in the outside world and was already a government official, had come to Walsall on holiday for a short guest course in the glass bead game, as he had in fact done once before, several years earlier. The evening they spent together, however, proved an embarrassment to both friends. Plinio was here as a guest student, a tolerated dilettante from outside. Although he was pursuing his course with great eagerness, it was nevertheless a course for outsiders and amateurs. The distance between them was too great. He was facing a professional, an initiate whose very delicacy and polite interest in his friend's enthusiasm for the glass bead game inevitably made him feel that he was not a colleague, but a child playfully dabbling on the outer edges of a science which the other understood to its very core. Knecht tried to turn the conversation away from the game by asking Plinio about his official functions and his life on the outside. And now Joseph was the laggard and the child who asked innocent questions and was tactfully tutored. Plinio had gone into law, was seeking political influence, and was about to become engaged to the daughter of a party leader. He spoke a language that Joseph only half understood. Many recurrent expressions sounded empty to him, or seemed to have no content. At any rate, he realized that Plinio counted for something in his world, knew his way about in it, and had ambitious aims. But the two worlds, which 10 years ago both youths had each touched with tentative curiosity and a measure of sympathy, had by now grown irreconcilably apart. Joseph could appreciate the fact that this man of the world and politician had retained a certain attachment to Castalia. This was, after all, the second time he was sacrificing a holiday to the Glass Bead Game. But in the end, Joseph thought, it was pretty much the same as if he were one day to pay a visit to Plinio's district and attend a few sessions of the court as a curious guest, and have Plinio show him through a few factories or welfare institutions. Both were disappointed. Knecht found his former friend coarse and superficial. Designori, for his part, found his former schoolmate distinctly haughty in his exclusive esotericism and intellectuality. He seemed to Plinio to have become a pure intellect, altogether absorbed by himself and his sport. Both made an effort, however, and Designori had all sorts of tales to tell, about his studies and examinations, about journeys to England and to the south, political meetings, Parliament. At one point, moreover, he said something that sounded like a threat or a warning. "You will see," he said. "Soon there will be times of unrest, perhaps wars, in which case your whole existence in Castalia might well come under attack." Joseph did not take this too seriously. He merely asked, "And what about you, Plinio? In that case, would you be for or against Castalia?" "Oh, that," Plinio said with a forced smile. "It's not likely that I'd be asked my opinion. But of course I favor the undisturbed continuance of Castalia. Otherwise I wouldn't be here, you know. Still, in all, although your material requirements are so modest, Castalia costs the country quite a little sum every year." "Yes," Joseph said, laughing. "It amounts, I am told, to about 1/10 of what our country used to spend annually for armaments during the century of wars." They met several more times, and the closer the end of Plinio's course approached, the more assiduous they became in courtesies toward each other. But it was a relief to both when the 2 or 3 weeks were over and Plinio departed. The Magister Ludi at that time was Thomas von der Trave, a famous, widely traveled, and cosmopolitan man, gracious and obliging toward everyone who approached him, but severe to the point of fanaticism in guarding the game against contamination. He was a great worker, something unsuspected by those who knew him only in his public role, dressed in his festive robes to conduct the great games, or receiving delegations from abroad. He was said to be a cool, even icy rationalist, whose relationship to the arts was one of mere distant civility. Among the young and ardent amateurs of the Glass Bead Game, rather deprecatory opinions of him could be heard at times. Misjudgments. For if he was not an enthusiast, and in the great public games tended to avoid touching on grand and exciting themes, the brilliant construction and unequaled form of his games proved to the cognoscenti his total grasp of the subtlest problems of the games world. One day the Magister Ludi sent for Joseph Knecht. He received him in his home, in everyday clothes, and asked whether he would care to come for half an hour every day at this same time for the next few days. Knecht, who had never before had any private dealings with the master, was somewhat astonished. For the present, the master showed him a bulky memorandum, a proposal he had received from an organist, one of the innumerable proposals which the directorate of the game regularly had to examine. Usually these were suggestions for the admission of new material to the archives. One man, for example, had made a meticulous study of the history of the madrigal, and discovered in the development of the style a curve that he had expressed both musically and mathematically, so that it could be included in the vocabulary of the game. Another had examined the rhythmic structure of Julius Caesar's Latin, and discovered the most striking congruences with the results of well-known studies of the intervals in Byzantine hymns. Or again, some fanatic had once more unearthed some new Kabbalah hidden in the musical notation of the 15th century. Then there were the tempestuous letters from abstruse experimenters who could arrive at the most astounding conclusions from, say, a comparison of the horoscopes of Goethe and Spinoza. Such letters often included pretty and seemingly enlightening geometric drawings in several colors. Knecht attacked the manuscript with eagerness. He himself, after all, had often pondered such proposals, although he had never submitted any. Every active Glass Bead Game player naturally dreams of a constant expansion of the fields of the game until they include the entire universe. Or rather, he'd constantly perform such expansions in his imagination and his private games, and cherishes the secret desire for the ones which seem to prove their viability to be crowned by official acceptance. The true and ultimate finesse in the private games of advanced players consists, of course, in their developing such mastery over the expressive, nomenclatural, and formative factors of the game that they can inject individual and original ideas into any given game played with objective historical materials. A distinguished botanist once whimsically expressed the idea in an aphorism. The Glass Bead Game should admit of everything, even that a single plant should chat in Latin with Linnaeus. Knecht, then, helped the Magister analyze the suggestion. The half-hour passed swiftly. He came punctually the next day, and so for 2 weeks came daily for a half-hour session with the Magister Ludi. During the first few days it struck him that the master was asking him to work carefully and critically through altogether inferior memoranda, whose uselessness was evident at first glance. He wondered that the master had time for this sort of thing, and gradually became aware that the purpose was not just to lighten the master's workload. Rather, this assignment, although necessary in itself, was giving the master a chance to subject him, the young adept, to an extremely courteous but stringent examination. What was taking place was rather similar to the appearance of the music master in his boyhood. He suddenly became aware of it now by the behavior of his associates, who treated him more shyly, reservedly, and sometimes with ironic respect. Something was in the wind. He sensed it, but now it was far less a source of joy than it had been then. After the last of these sessions, the Magister Ludi said in his rather high, courteous voice, and in that carefully enunciated speech of his, but without the slightest solemnity, "Very well. You need not come tomorrow. Our business is completed for the moment. But I shall soon be having to trouble you again. Many thanks for your collaboration. It has been valuable to me. Incidentally, in my opinion, you ought to apply for your admission to the order now. There will be no difficulties. I have already informed the heads of the order." As he rose, he added, "One word more, just by the way. Probably you, too, sometimes incline, as most good Glass Bead Game players do in their youth, to use our game as a kind of instrument for philosophizing. My words alone will not cure you of that, but nevertheless I shall say them. Philosophizing should be done only with legitimate tools, those of philosophy. Our game is neither philosophy nor religion. It is a discipline of its own, in character most akin to art. It is an art sui generis. One makes greater strides if one holds to that view from the first, than if one reaches it only after 100 failures. The philosopher Kant, he is little known today, but he was a formidable thinker, once said that theological philosophizing was a magic lantern of chimeras. We should not make our Glass Bead Game into that." Joseph was surprised. His excitement was so great that he almost failed to hear the last cautionary remarks. It had flashed through his mind that this meant the end of his freedom, the completion of his period of study, admission to the order, and his imminent enrollment in the ranks of the hierarchy. He expressed his thanks with a low bow, and went promptly to the secretariat of the order in Walsall, where, sure enough, he found himself already inscribed on the list of new nominees to the order. Like all students at his level, He knew the rules of the order fairly well, and remembered that the ceremony of admission could be performed by every member of the order who held an official post in the higher ranks. He therefore requested that this be done by the music master, obtained a pass and a short furlough, and next day set out for Montport, where his patron and friend was staying. He found the venerable old master ailing, but was welcomed with rejoicing. "You have come just in time," the old man said. "Soon I would no longer be empowered to receive you into the order as a younger brother. I am about to resign my office. My release has already been granted." The ceremony itself was simple. On the following day, the music master invited 2 brothers of the order to be present as witnesses, as prescribed by the statutes. Previously, he had given Knecht a paragraph from the rules as the subject of a meditation exercise. It was the familiar passage, "If the high authority appoints you to an office, know this: every step upward on the ladder of offices is not a step into freedom, but into bondage. The higher the office, the tighter the bondage. The greater the power of the office, the stricter the service. The stronger the personality, the less self-will." The group then assembled in the Magister's music cell, the same in which Knecht had long ago been introduced to the art of meditation. The master called upon the novice, in honor of the initiation, to play a chorale prelude by Bach. Then one of the witnesses read aloud the abbreviated version of the rules of the order, and the music master himself asked the ritual questions and received his young friend's oath. He accorded Joseph another hour. They sat in the garden, and the master advised him on how to identify himself with the rules and live by them. "It is good," he said, "that at the moment I am departing, you are stepping into the breach. It is as if I had a son who will stand in my stead." And when he saw Joseph's sad look, he added, "Come now, don't be downcast. I'm not. I am very tired and looking forward to the leisure I mean to enjoy, and which you will share with me frequently, I hope. And next time we meet, use the familiar pronoun of address to me. I could not offer that as long as I held office." He dismissed him with that winning smile which Joseph had now known for 20 years. Knecht returned quickly to Walsall, for he had been given only 3 days' leave. He was barely back when the Magister Ludi sent for him, greeted him affably as one colleague to another, and congratulated him on his admission to the order. "All that is now lacking to make us completely colleagues and associates," he continued, "is your assignment to a definite place in our organization." Joseph was somewhat taken aback. So this would be the end of his freedom. "Oh," he said timidly, "I hope I can prove useful in some modest spot somewhere. But to be candid with you, I had been hoping I would be able to continue studying freely for a while longer." The Magister looked straight into his eyes with a faintly ironic smile. "You say a while, but how long is that?" Knecht gave an embarrassed laugh. "I really don't know." "So I thought," the master said. "You are still speaking the language of students and thinking in student terms, Joseph Knecht. That is quite all right now, but soon it will no longer be all right, for we need you. Besides, you know that later on, even in the highest offices of our order, you can obtain leaves for purposes of study, if you can persuade the authorities of the value of these studies. My predecessor and teacher, for example, while he was still Magister Ludi and an old man, requested and received a full year's furlough for studies in the London archives. But he received his furlough not for a while, but for a specific number of months, weeks, and days. Henceforth you will have to count on that. And now I have a proposal to make to you. We need a reliable man who is as yet unknown outside our circle for a special mission." The assignment was the following. The Benedictine monastery of Mariafels one of the oldest centers of learning in the country, which maintained friendly relations with Castalia, and in particular had favored the glass bead game for decades, had asked him to send a young teacher for a prolonged stay, to give introductory courses in the game, and also to stimulate the few advanced players in the monastery. The Magister's choice had fallen upon Joseph Knecht. That was why he had been so discreetly tested. That was why his entry into the order had been accelerated. Chapter 4. 2 Orders. In a good many respects, Joseph Knecht's situation was once again similar to that in his Latin school days after the music master's visit. Joseph himself would scarcely have imagined that the appointment to Mariafels represented a special distinction and a large first step on the ladder of the hierarchy, but he was, after all, a good deal wiser about such matters nowadays, and could plainly read the significance of his summons in the attitude and conduct of his fellow students. Of course, he had belonged for some time to the innermost circle within the elite of the glass bead game players, but now the unusual assignment marked him to all and sundry as a young man whom the superiors had their eye on, and whom they intended to employ. His associates and ambitious fellow players did not exactly withdraw or become unfriendly. The members of this highly aristocratic group were far too well-mannered for that, but an aloofness nevertheless arose. Yesterday's friend might well be tomorrow's superior, and this circle registered and expressed such gradations and differentiations by the most delicate shades of behavior. One exception was Fritz Tegularius, whom we may well call, next to Ferramonte, Joseph Knecht's closest friend throughout his life. Tegularius, destined by his gifts for the highest achievements, but severely hampered by certain deficiencies of health, balance, and self-confidence, was the same age as Knecht at the time of Knecht's admission to the order, that is, about 34, and had first met him some 10 years earlier in a glass bead game course. At the time, Knecht had sensed how strong an attraction he exerted upon this quiet and rather melancholy youth. With that psychological instinct which he possessed even then, although without precisely knowing it, he likewise grasped the essence of this love on the part of Tegularius. It was friendship ready for unconditional devotion, a respect capable of the utmost subordination. It was imbued with an almost religious fervor, but overshadowed and held in bounds by an aristocratic reserve and a foreboding of inner tragedy. In the beginning, still shaken and oversensitive, not to say suspicious, as a result of the Designori episode, Knecht had held Tegularius at a distance by consistent sternness, although he too felt drawn to this interesting and unusual schoolfellow. For a characterization of Tegularius, we may use a page from Knecht's confidential memoranda, which years later he regularly drew up for the exclusive use of the highest authorities. It reads, Tegularius, personal friend of the writer, recipient of several honors at school in Keuperheim, good classical philologist, strong interest in philosophy, worked on Leibniz, Bolzano, subsequently Plato, the most brilliant and gifted glass bead game player I know. He would be predestined for Magister Ludi, were it not that his character, together with his frail health, make him completely unsuited for that position. T should never be appointed to an outstanding, representative, or organizational position. That would be a misfortune for him and for the office. His deficiency takes physical form in states of low vitality, periods of insomnia and nervous aches, psychologically in spells of melancholy, a hunger for solitude, fear of duties and responsibilities, and probably also in thoughts of suicide. Dangerous though his situation is, by the aid of meditation and great self-discipline he keeps himself going so courageously that most of his acquaintances have no idea of how severely he suffers, and are aware only of his great shyness and taciturnity. But although T, unfortunately, is not fitted for higher posts, he is nevertheless a jewel in the Vicus Lusorum, an altogether irreplaceable treasure. He has mastered the technique of our game like a great musician his instrument. He instinctively finds the most delicate nuances, and is also an exceptional instructor. In the advanced and highest review courses, for my part he would be wasted in the lower ones, I could scarcely manage without him any longer. The way he analyzes the specimen games of boys without ever discouraging them, the way he detects their tricks, infallibly recognizes and exposes everything imitative or purely decorative, the way he finds the sources of error in a game that has started well but then gone astray, and lays these errors bare like flawlessly prepared anatomical specimens, is altogether unique. It is this sharp and incorruptible talent for analysis and correction that assures him the respect of students and colleagues, which otherwise might have been jeopardized by his unstable demeanor and shyness. I should like to cite an example to illustrate T.'s brilliance as a glass bead game player. During the early days of my friendship with him, when both of us were already finding little more to learn by way of technique in our courses, he once, it was a moment of unusual trust, allowed me to look at several games he had composed. I saw at a glance that they were brilliantly devised and somehow novel and original in style, asked to borrow the sketches for study, and discovered that these game compositions were true literary productions, so amazing and singular that I feel I should speak of them here. These games were little dramas, in structure almost pure monologues, reflecting the imperiled but brilliant life of the author's mind like a perfect self-portrait. The various themes and groups of themes on which the games were based, and their sequences and confrontations, were brilliantly conceived, dialectically orchestrated and counterpoised. But beyond that, the synthesis and harmonization of the opposing voices was not carried to the ultimate conclusion in the usual classical manner. Rather, this harmonization underwent a whole series of refractions, of splintering into overtones, and paused each time as if wearied and despairing, just on the point of dissolution, finally fading out in questioning and doubt. As a result, those games possessed a stirring chromatics, of a kind never before ventured as far as I know. Moreover, the games as a whole expressed a tragic doubt and renunciation. They became figurative statements of the dubiousness of all intellectual endeavor. At the same time, in their intellectual structure, as well as in their calligraphic technique and perfection, they were so extraordinarily beautiful that they brought tears to one's eyes. Each of these games moved with such gravity and sincerity toward solution, only at the last so nobly to forego the attempt at solution, that it was like a perfect elegy upon the transitoriness inherent in all beautiful things, and the ultimate dubiety immanent in all soaring flights of the intellect. Item. I would recommend Tegularius, if he should outlive me or my term in office, as an extremely fine, precious, but imperiled treasure. He should be granted maximum freedom. He should be consulted on all important questions concerning the game, but students should never be placed in his sole guidance. In the course of the years, this remarkable man had become Knecht's true friend. He admired Knecht's capacity for leadership as well as his mind, and showed a touching devotion toward him. In fact, much of what we know about Knecht has been handed down by Tegularius. In the innermost circle of younger glass bead game players, he was perhaps the only one who did not envy his friend for the important assignment he had received, and the only one for whom Knecht's absence for an indefinite time meant an almost unbearable anguish and sense of loss. Joseph himself rejoiced in the new state of affairs as soon as he recovered from the shock of suddenly being shorn of his beloved freedom. He felt eagerness to travel, pleasure in activity, and curiosity about the alien world to which he was being sent. Incidentally, he was not allowed to depart from Mariafels without preparation. First, he was assigned to the police for 3 weeks. That was the student's name for the small department within the Board of Educators, which might be called its political department, or even its foreign ministry, were these not somewhat grandiose names for so small an affair. There he received instruction in the rules of conduct for brothers of the order during their stays in the outside world. Dubois, the head of this office, personally devoted an hour to him nearly every day. This conscientious man seemed worried that an altogether untried young man without the faintest knowledge of the world should be sent to such a foreign post. He made no attempt to conceal his disapproval of the Magister Ludi's decision, and took extra pains to inform this new member of the order on the facts of life in the outside world and the means for effectively combating its perils. His sincere paternal solicitude, fortunately, was matched by Joseph's willingness to be instructed. The result was that during those hours of introduction into the rules of intercourse with the world, the teacher conceived a real affection for Joseph Knecht, and finally felt able to dismiss him, reassured and fully confident that the young man would be able to carry out his mission successfully. Dubois even tried, more out of personal goodwill than the demands of politics, to give Joseph a kind of additional assignment on his own behalf. As one of Castalia's few politicians, Dubois was one of that tiny group of officials whose thoughts and studies were largely devoted to sustaining the legal and economic continuance of Castalia, to regulating its relationship to the outside world and the problems that arose from its dependence on the world. The great majority of Castalians, the officials no less than the scholars and students, lived in their pedagogic province and their order as if these constituted a stable, eternal, inevitable world. They knew, of course, that it had not always existed, that it had come into being slowly and amid bitter struggles in times of cruel distress. They knew it had originated at the end of the age of wars, out of a double source: the heroically ascetic efforts of scholars, artists, and thinkers who had come to their senses, and the profound craving of the exhausted, bled, and betrayed peoples for order, normality, reason, lawfulness, and moderation. Castalians knew this, and understood the function of all the orders and pedagogic provinces throughout the world: to abstain from government and competition, and instead to assure stability for the spiritual foundations of moderation and law everywhere. But that the present order of things was not to be taken for granted, that it presupposed a certain harmony between the world and the guardians of culture, that this harmony could always be disrupted, and that world history, taken as a whole, by no means furthered what was desirable, rational, and beautiful in the life of man, but at best only occasionally tolerated it as an exception, all this they did not realize. Except for those few political thinkers like Dubois, almost all Castalians were unaware of the secret complex of problems underlying the existence of Castalia. Once Knecht won the confidence of Dubois, he was given a glimpse of the political foundations of Castalia. At first the subject struck him as rather repellent and uninteresting, which indeed was the reaction of most members of the order. But then he recalled Plinio de Signore's remark about possible dangers to Castalia. Along with that recollection there flooded back into his mind the whole bitter aftertaste of his youthful debates with Plinio, seemingly long since settled and forgotten. Now these suddenly seemed to him of the highest importance, and, moreover, a stage on the road to his awakening. At the end of their last talk, Dubois said to him, "I think I can let you go now. You are to adhere strictly to the assignment His Honor the Magister Ludi has given you, and no less strictly to the rules of conduct we have taught you here. It was a pleasure to me to be able to help you. You will see that the 3 weeks we have kept you were not time lost, and if you should ever want to recompense me for my contribution to your education, I can suggest a way. You will be entering a Benedictine abbey, and if you stay there a while and commend yourself to the fathers, you will probably hear political conversations and sense political currents among the venerable fathers and their guests. If you would occasionally inform me about such matters, I would be grateful. Please understand me aright. You are certainly not to regard yourself as a kind of spy, or in any way misuse confidences. You are not to pass along anything that goes against your conscience. I guarantee that we will use any information we may receive only in the interest of our order and Castalia. We are not real politicians and have no power at all. But we, too, are dependent on the world, which either needs or tolerates us. Circumstances may arise in which we might profit by knowing that a statesman is making a retreat in a monastery, or that the Pope is said to be ill, or that new candidates have been added to the list of future cardinals. We are not dependent on your information. We have quite a variety of sources, but one little source more can do no harm. Go now. You need not say yes or no to this matter. For the present, all that is needed is for you to comport yourself well in your official assignment, and do us honor among the spiritual fathers. Bon voyage. In the Book of Changes, which Knecht consulted by means of the yarrow stock ritual before he set out, he counted out the hexagram Lu, which signifies the wanderer, and the augury, success through smallness, persistence is good fortune to the wanderer. He found a 6 for the second place, which yielded the interpretation, the wanderer comes to the inn. He has his possessions with him. He receives the persistent attentions of a young servant. Knecht's leave-taking went off cheerfully, except that his last talk with Tegularius proved to be a hard test of both their characters. Fritz controlled himself by extreme effort, and appeared absolutely frozen in the coolness he forced himself to display. For him, the best he had was departing with his friend. Knecht's nature did not permit so passionate and above all so exclusive an attachment to a friend. If need be, he could get along without one, and could direct his affections easily toward new objects and people. This parting was not a painful loss for him, but he knew his friend well enough to know what a shock and trial it meant for him, and he was concerned. He had given much thought to the nature of this friendship, and had once spoken about it with the music master. To a certain extent he had learned to objectify his own experience and feelings, and to regard them critically. In so doing, he had become aware that it was not really, or at any rate not only, his friend's great talent that attracted him to Tegularius. Rather, it was the association of this talent with such serious defects, such great fragility. And he realized that the single-mindedness of the love Tegularius offered him had not only its beautiful aspect, but also a dangerous attraction, for it tempted him to display his power over one weaker in strength, though not in love. Therefore, in this relationship he had made restraint and self-discipline his duty to the last. Fond though he was of Tegularius, the friendship would not have acquired so deep a meaning for him if it had not taught him something about the dominion he had over others weaker and less secure than himself. He learned that this power to influence others was part and parcel of the educator's gift, and that it concealed dangers and imposed responsibility. Tegularius, after all, was only one of many. In the eyes of quite a few others, Knecht read silent courtship. At the same time, during the past year, he had become far more conscious of the highly charged atmosphere in which he lived in the Glass Bead Game village. For there he was part of an officially non-existent, but very sharply defined circle or class, the finest elite among the candidates and tutors of the Glass Bead Game. Now and then, one or another of that group would be called upon to serve in an auxiliary capacity under the magister or archivist, or to help teach one of the game courses, but they were never assigned to the lower or middle level of officialdom or the teaching corps. They provided the reserve for filling vacancies in leading posts. They knew one another thoroughly. They had almost no illusions about talents, characters, and achievements. And precisely because among these initiates and aspirants for the highest dignities, each one was preeminent, each of the very first rank in performance, knowledge, and academic record, precisely for that reason those traits and nuances of character which predestined a candidate for leadership and success inevitably counted for a great deal and were closely observed. A dash more or less of graciousness, of suasion with younger men or with the authorities, of amiability, was of great importance in this group, and could give its possessor a definite edge over his rivals. Fritz Tegularius plainly belonged to this circle merely as an outsider. He was tolerated as a guest, but kept at the periphery because he had no gift for rule. Just as plainly, Knecht belonged to the innermost circle. What appealed to the young and made them his admirers was his wholesome vigor and still youthful charm, which appeared to be resistant to passions, incorruptible, and then again boyishly irresponsible, a kind of innocence, that is. And what commended him to his superiors was the reverse side of this innocence, his freedom from ambition and craving for success. Of late, the effects of his personality had begun to dawn upon the young man. He became aware of his attraction for those below him, and gradually, belatedly, of how he affected those above him. And when he looked back from his new standpoint of awareness to his boyhood, he found both lines running through his life and shaping it. Classmates and younger boys had always courted him. Superiors had taken benevolent note of him. There had been exceptions, such as Headmaster Zbinden, but on the other hand, he had been recipient of such distinctions as the patronage of the music master, and latterly of Dubois and the Magister Ludi. It was all perfectly plain, in spite of which Knecht had never been willing to see it and accept it in its entirety. Obviously, his fate was to enter the elite everywhere, to find admiring friends and highly placed patrons. It happened of its own accord, without his trying. Obviously, he would not be allowed to settle down in the shadows at the base of the hierarchy. He must move steadily toward its apex, approach the bright light at the top. He would not be a subordinate or an independent scholar. He would be a master. That he grasped this later than others in a similar position gave him that indescribable extra magic, that note of innocence. But why was it that he realized it so late and so reluctantly? Because he had not sought it at all, and did not want it. He had no need to dominate, took no pleasure in commanding. He desired the contemplative far more than the active life, and would have been content to spend many years more, if not his whole life, as an obscure student, an inquiring and reverent pilgrim through the sanctuaries of the past, the cathedrals of music, the gardens and forests of mythology, languages, and ideas. Now that he saw himself being pushed inexorably into the vita activa, he was more than ever aware of the tensions of the aspirations, the rivalries, the ambitions among those around him. He felt his innocence threatened and no longer tenable. Now, he realized, he must desire and affirm the position that was being thrust upon him. Otherwise he would be haunted by a feeling of imprisonment and nostalgia for the freedom of the past 10 years. And since he was not as yet altogether ready for that affirmation, he felt his temporary departure from Waldsell and the province, his journey out into the world, as a great relief and release. The monastery of Mariafels, through the many centuries of its existence, had shared in the making and the suffering of the history of the West. It had experienced periods of flowering and decline, had passed through rebirths and new nadirs, and had been at various times and in assorted fields famous and brilliant. Once a center of scholastic learning and the art of disputation, still possessing an enormous library of medieval theology, it had risen to new glory after periods of slackness and sluggishness. It then became famous for its music, its much-praised choir, and the masses and oratorios composed and performed by the fathers. From those days it still retained a fine musical tradition. 6 nut-brown chests full of music manuscripts, and the finest organ in the country. Then the monastery had entered a political era, which had likewise left behind a tradition and a certain skill. In times of war and barbarization, Mariafels had several times become a little island of rationality, where the better minds among the opposed parties cautiously sought each other out and groped their way toward reconciliation. And once, that was the last high point in its history, Mariafels had been the birthplace of a peace treaty which for a while met the longings of the exhausted nations. Afterward, when a new age began and Castalia was founded, the monastery took an attitude of wait and see, was in fact rather hostile, presumably on instructions from Rome. A request from the Board of Educators to grant hospitality to a scholar who wished to work for a time in the monastery's scholastic library was politely turned down, as was an invitation to send a representative to a conference of musicologists. Intercourse between Castalia and the monastery had first begun in the time of Abbot Pius, who, in his latter years, became keenly interested in the Glass Bead Game. Ever since then, a friendly, though not very lively, relationship had developed. Books were exchanged, reciprocal hospitality granted. Knecht's patron, the music master, had spent a few weeks in Mariafels during his younger years, copying music manuscripts and playing the famous organ. Knecht knew of this, and rejoiced at the prospect of staying in a place of which his venerated master had occasionally spoken with pleasure. The respect and politeness with which he was received went so far beyond his expectations that he felt rather embarrassed. This was, after all, the first time that Castalia had offered the monastery a glass bead game player of high distinction for an indefinite period. Joseph had learned from Dubois that he was not to regard himself as an individual, especially during the early period of his stay, but solely as the representative of Castalia, and that he was to accept and respond both to courtesies and possible aloofness solely as an ambassador. That attitude helped him through his initial constraint. He likewise soon overcame the feelings of strangeness, anxiety, and mild excitability which troubled his first few nights and kept him from sleeping. And since Abbot Gervasius displayed a good-natured and merry benevolence toward him, he quickly came to feel at ease in his new environment. The freshness and vigor of the landscape delighted him. The monastery was situated in rough, mountainous country, full of abrupt cliffs and pockets of rich pasture where handsome cattle grazed. He savored with deep pleasure the massiveness and size of the ancient buildings, in which the history of many centuries could be read. He enjoyed the beauty and simple comfort of his apartment, 2 rooms on the top floor of the guest wing. For recreation, he went on exploratory walks through the fine little city-state with its 2 churches, cloisters, archives, library, abbot's apartment, and courtyards, with its extensive barns filled with thrifty livestock, its gurgling fountains, gigantic vaulted wine and fruit cellars, its 2 refectories, the famous chapter house, the well-tended gardens and the workshops of the lay brothers, cooper, cobbler, tailor, smith, and so on, all forming a small village around the largest courtyard. He was granted entry to the library. The organist showed him the great organ and allowed him to play on it, and he was strongly attracted to the chests in which an impressive number of unpublished and to some extent quite unknown music manuscripts of earlier ages awaited study. The monks did not seem to be terribly impatient for him to begin his official functions. Not only days, but weeks passed before anyone seriously brought up the real purpose of his presence there. From his first day, it was true, some of the fathers, and the abbot himself in particular, had been eager to chat with Joseph about the glass bead game. But no one said anything about instruction or any other systematic work with the game. In other respects, too, Knecht felt that the manners, style of life, and general tone of intercourse among the monks was couched in a tempo hitherto unknown to him. There was a kind of venerable slowness, a leisurely and benign patience in which all these fathers seemed to share, including those whose temperaments seemed rather more active. It was the spirit of their order, the millennial pace of an age-old, privileged community whose orderly existence had survived hundreds of vicissitudes. They all shared it, as every bee shares the fate of its hive, sleeps its sleep, suffers its sufferings, trembles with its trembling. This Benedictine temper seemed at first glance less intellectual, less supple and acute, less active than the style of life in Castalia, but on the other hand calmer, less malleable, older, more resistant to tribulation. The spirit and mentality of this place had long ago achieved a harmony with nature. With curiosity and intense interest, and with great admiration as well, Knecht submitted to the mood of life in this monastery, which, at a time before Castalia existed, had been almost the same as it was now, and even then 1,500 years old, and which was so congenial to the contemplative side of his nature. He was an honored guest, honored far beyond his expectations and deserts. But he felt distinctly that these courtesies were a matter of form and custom, and not specially addressed to him as a person, nor to the spirit of Castalia or of the Glass Bead Game. Rather, the Benedictines were displaying the majestic politeness of an ancient power to a younger one. He had been only partly prepared for this implicit superiority, and after a while, for all that his life in Mariafels was proving so agreeable, he began to feel so insecure that he asked his authorities for more precise instructions on how to conduct himself. The Magister Ludi in person wrote him a few lines. "Don't worry about taking all the time you need for your study of the life there. Profit by your days, learn, try to make yourself well-liked and useful insofar as you find your hosts receptive, but do not obtrude yourself, and never seem more impatient, never seem to be under more pressure than they. Even if they should go on treating you for an entire year as if each day were your first as a guest in their house, enter calmly into the spirit of it and behave as if 2 or even 10 years more do not matter to you. Take it as a test in the practice of patience. Meditate carefully. If time hangs heavy on your hands, set aside a few hours every day, no more than 4, for some regular work, study, or the copying of manuscripts, say. But avoid giving the impression of diligence. Be at the disposal of everyone who wishes to chat with you." Knecht followed this advice, and soon began feeling more relaxed. Hitherto he had been thinking too much of his assignment to act as instructor to amateur glass bead game players, the ostensible reason for his mission here, whereas the fathers of the monastery were treating him rather as the envoy of a friendly power who must be kept in good humor. And when at last Abbot Gervasius recollected the assignment and brought him together with several of the monks who had already had an introduction to the art of the glass bead game, and hoped he would give them a more advanced course, it turned out to his astonishment and his intense disappointment that the noble game was cultivated in a most superficial and amateurish way at this hospitable place. He would evidently have to content himself with a very modest level of knowledge of the game. Slowly, though, he came to realize that he had not really been sent here for the sake of lifting the standards of the glass bead game in the monastery. The assignment of coaching the few fathers moderately devoted to the game and equipping them with a modest degree of skill was easy, much too easy. Any other adept at the game, even if he were still far from belonging to the elite, would have been equal to the task. Instruction, then, could not be the real purpose of his mission. He began to realize that he had probably been sent here less to teach than to learn. However, just as he thought he had grasped this, his authority in the monastery, and consequently his self-assurance, was unexpectedly reinforced. This came in the nick of time, for in spite of all the charms of being a guest there, he had already at times begun to feel his stay as something like a punitive transfer. One day, however, in a conversation with the abbot, he inadvertently made some allusion to the Chinese I Ching. The abbot showed marked interest, asked a few questions, and could not disguise his delight when he found his guest so unexpectedly versed in Chinese and the Book of Changes. The abbot, too, was fond of the I Ching. He knew no Chinese, and his knowledge of the Book of Oracles and other Chinese mysteries was limited, In all their scholarly interests, the present inmates of the monastery seemed content with a harmless smattering. Nevertheless, this intelligent man, who was so much more experienced and worldly wise than his guest, obviously had a real feeling for the spirit of ancient Chinese attitudes toward politics and life. A conversation of unusual liveliness ensued. For the first time, real warmth was injected into the prevailing tone of remote courtesy between host and guest. The consequence was that Knecht was asked to give the abbot instruction in the I Ching twice a week. While his relationship to his host, the abbot, thus increased in liveliness and meaning, while his friendly fellowship with the organist throve and the small ecclesiastical state in which he lived gradually became familiar territory to him, the promise of the oracle he had consulted before leaving Castalia also neared fulfillment. As the wanderer who carried his possessions with him, he had been promised not only the shelter of an inn, but also the persistent attentions of a young servant. The wanderer felt justified in taking the consummation of this promise as a good sign, a sign that he in truth had his possessions with him. In other words, far away from the schools, teachers, friends, patrons, and helpers, far from the nourishing and salutary home atmosphere of Castalia, he carried within himself the spirit and the energies of the province, and with their aid he was moving toward an active and useful life. The foretold young servant, as it turned out, appeared in the shape of a seminary pupil named Anton. Although this young man subsequently played no part in Joseph Knecht's life, in Joseph's peculiarly divided mood during his sojourn in the monastery, the boy seemed a harbinger of new and greater things. Anton was a close-mouthed youngster, but temperamental and talented-looking, and almost ready for admission into the community of monks. Joseph's path often crossed his, whereas he scarcely knew any of the other seminary pupils, who were confined in a wing by themselves, where guests were not admitted. In fact, it was obvious that they were being kept from contact with him. Seminary pupils were not permitted to participate in the game course. Anton worked as a helper in the library several times a week. Here it was that Knecht met him, and occasionally had a few words with him. As time went on, it became evident to Knecht that this young man with the intense eyes under heavy black brows was devoted to him with that enthusiasm and readiness to serve so typical of the boyish adoration he had encountered so often by now. Although every time it happened he felt a desire to fend it off, he had long ago come to recognize it as a vital element in the life of the Castalian order. But in the monastery he decided to be doubly withdrawn. He felt it would be a violation of hospitality to exert any sway over this boy, who is still subject to the discipline of religious education. Moreover, he was well aware that strict chastity was the commandment here, and this, it seemed to him, could make a boyish infatuation even more dangerous. In any case, he must avoid any chance of giving offense, and he governed himself accordingly. In the library, the one place where he habitually met Anton, he also made the acquaintance of a man he had at first almost failed to notice, so modest was his appearance. In time, however, he was to know him very well indeed, and to love him for the rest of his life with the kind of grateful reverence he felt, otherwise, only toward the now retired music-master. The man was Father Jacobus, perhaps the most eminent historian of the Benedictine order. He was at that time about 60, a spare, elderly man with a sparrowhawk's head on a long, sinewy neck. Seen from the front, his face had something dull and lifeless about it, since he was chary of gazing outward, but his profile, with the boldly curved line of the forehead, the deep furrow above the sharp bridge of his hooked nose, and the rather short but attractively shaped chin, suggested a definite and original personality. This quiet old man, who, incidentally, on closer acquaintance, could be extremely vivacious, had a table of his own in a small room off the main hall of the library. Though the monastery possessed such priceless books, he seemed to be the only really serious working scholar in the place. It was, by the way, the novice Anton who by chance called Joseph Knecht's attention to Father Jacobus. Knecht had noticed that the room in which the scholar had his table was regarded almost as a private domain. The few users of the library entered it only if they had to, and then moved softly and respectfully on tiptoe, although the father bent over his books did not appear to be easily disturbed. Knecht, of course, quickly imitated this circumspection, and thereby remained at a remove from the industrious old man. One day, however, when Anton had brought Father Jacobus some books, Knecht noticed how the young man lingered a moment at the open door of the study, looking back at the scholar already absorbed in his work again. There was adoration in Anton's face, an expression of admiration and reverence mingled with those emotions of affectionate consideration and helpfulness that well-bred youth sometimes manifests toward the paltriness and fragility of age. Knecht's first reaction was delight. The sight was pleasing in itself, as well as evidence that Anton could so look up to older men without any trace of physical feeling. A rather sarcastic thought followed immediately, a thought Joseph felt almost ashamed of. How poor the state of scholarship must be in this institution, that the only seriously active scholar in the place was stared at as if he were a fabulous beast. Nevertheless, Anton's look of reverent admiration for the old man opened Knecht's eyes. He became aware of the learned father's existence. He himself took to throwing a glance now and then at the man, discovered his Roman profile, and gradually found out one thing and another about Father Jacobus which seemed to suggest a most extraordinary mind and character. Knecht had already learned that he was a historian, and regarded as the foremost authority on the history of the Benedictine order. One day the father spoke to him. His manner of speech had none of the broad, deliberately benevolent, deliberately good-natured, somewhat avuncular tone which seemed to be the style of the monastery. Speaking in a low and almost timorous voice, but placing his stresses with a wonderful precision, he invited Joseph to visit him in his room after vespers. "You will find in me," he said, "neither a specialist on the history of Castalia nor a glass bead game player. But since, as it now seems, our two so different orders are forming ever closer ties of friendship, I should not wish to exclude myself, and would be happy to take personal advantage now and then of your presence among us." He spoke with utter seriousness, but his low voice and shrewd old face conferred upon his all-too-polite phrases that wonderful note of equivocation, ranging through the whole compass from earnestness to irony, from deference to faint mockery, from passionate engagement to playfulness, such as may be sensed when two holy men or two princes of the church greet each other with endless bows in a game of mutual courtesies and trial of patience. This blending of superiority and mockery, of wisdom and obstinate ceremonial, was deeply familiar to Joseph Knecht from his studies of Chinese language and life. He found it marvelously refreshing, and realized that it was some time since he had last heard this tone, which, among others, the Glass Bead Game master Thomas commanded with consummate skill. With gratitude and pleasure, Joseph accepted the invitation. That evening he called at the father's rather isolated apartment at the end of a quiet side wing of the monastery. As he stood in the corridor, wondering which door to knock at, he heard piano music, to his considerable surprise. It was a sonata by Purcell, played unpretentiously and without virtuosity, but cleanly and in impeccable tempo. The pure music sounded through the door. Its heartfelt gaiety and sweet triads reminded him of the days in Walsall, when he had practiced pieces of this sort on various instruments with his friend Ferramante. He waited, listening with deep enjoyment for the end of the sonata. In the still, twilit corridor, it sounded so lonely and unworldly, and so brave and innocent also, both childlike and superior, as all good music must in the midst of the unredeemed muteness of the world. He knocked at the door. Father Jacobus called, "Come in," and received him with his unassuming dignity. 2 candles were still burning by the small piano. "Yes," Father Jacobus said in answer to Knecht's question. "I play for a half-hour or even an hour every night. I usually call a halt to my day's work when darkness falls, and would rather not read or write during the hours before sleep." They talked about music, about Purcell, Handel, the ancient musical tradition among the Benedictines, of all the Catholic orders the one most devoted to the arts. Knecht expressed a desire to know something of the history of the order. The conversation grew lively and touched on 100 questions. The old monk's historical knowledge seemed to be truly astounding, but he frankly admitted that the history of Castalia, of the Castalian idea and order, had not interested him. He had scarcely studied it, he said, and did not conceal his critical attitude toward this Castalia, whose order he regarded as an imitation of the Christian models, and fundamentally a blasphemous imitation, since the Castalian order had no religion, no God, and no church as its basis. Knecht listened respectfully, but pointed out that other than Benedictine and Roman Catholic views of religion, God and the Church were possible, and moreover had existed, and that it would not do to deny the purity of their intentions, nor their profound influence on the life of the mind. "Quite so," Jacobus said. "No doubt you are thinking of the Protestants, among others. They were unable to preserve religion and the Church, but at times they displayed a great deal of courage, and produced some exemplary men. I spent some years studying the various attempts at reconciliation among the hostile Christian denominations and churches, especially those of the period around 1700, when we find such people as the philosopher and mathematician Leibniz, and that eccentric Count Zinzendorf endeavoring to reunite the inimical brothers. Altogether, the 18th century, hasty and shallow though it often seems in its judgments, has such a rich and many-faceted intellectual history. The Protestants of that period strike me as particularly interesting. There was one man I discovered, a philologist, teacher, and educator of great stature, a Swabian pietist, by the way, whose moral influence can be clearly traced for 200 years after his death, but that is another subject. Let us return to the question of the legitimacy and historical mission of real orders. "Oh, no," Joseph Knecht broke in. "Please, say more about this teacher you have just mentioned. I almost think I can guess who he is." "Guess." "I thought at first of Franke of Halle, but since you say he was a Swabian, I can think of none other than Johann Albrecht Bengel." Jacobus laughed. An expression of pleasure transfigured his face. "You surprise me, my friend," he exclaimed. "It was indeed Bengel I had in mind. How do you happen to know of him? Or is it normal in your astonishing province that people know such abstruse and forgotten things and names? I would vouch that if you were to ask all the fathers, teachers, and pupils in our monastery, and those of the last few generations as well, not one would know this name. In Castalia, too, few would know it, perhaps no one besides myself and 2 of my friends. I once engaged in studies of 18th-century pietism for private reasons, and as it happened I was much impressed by several Swabian theologians, chief among them Bengel. At the time, he seemed to me the ideal teacher and guide for youth. I was so taken with the man that I even had a photo made of his portrait in an old book, and kept it above my desk." Father Jacobus continued to chuckle. "Our meeting is certainly taking place under unusual auspices," he said. "It is remarkable enough that you and I should both have come upon this forgotten man in the course of our studies. Perhaps it is even more remarkable that this Swabian Protestant should have been able to influence both a Benedictine monk and a Castalian glass bead game player. Incidentally, I imagine that your glass bead game is an art requiring a great deal of imagination, and wonder that so stringently sober a man as Bengel should have attracted you." Knecht, too, chuckled with amusement. "Well," he said, If you recall that Bengal devoted years of study to the revelation of St. John, and what sort of system he devised for interpreting its prophecies, you will have to admit that our friend could be the very opposite of sober. "That is true," Father Jacobus admitted gaily. "And how do you explain such contradictions?" "If you will permit me a joke, I would say that what Bengal lacked, and unconsciously longed for, was the Glass Bead Game. You see, I consider him among the secret forerunners and ancestors of our game." Cautiously, once again entirely in earnest, Jacobus countered, "It strikes me as rather bold to annex Bengal of all people for your pedigree. How do you justify it?" "It was only a joke, but a joke that can be defended. While he was still quite young, before he became engrossed in his great work on the Bible, Bengal once told friends of a cherished plan of his. He hoped, he said, to arrange and sum up all the knowledge of his time, symmetrically and synoptically, around a central idea. That is precisely what the Glass Bead Game does." "After all, the whole 18th century toyed with the encyclopedic idea," Father Jacobus protested. "So it did," Joseph agreed. But what Bengal meant was not just a juxtaposition of the fields of knowledge and research, but an interrelationship, an organic denominator. And that is one of the basic ideas of the Glass Bead Game. In fact, I would go further in my claims. If Bengal had possessed a system similar to that offered by our game, he probably would have been spared all the misguided effort involved in his calculation of the prophetic numbers and his enunciation of the Antichrist and the millennial kingdom. Bengal did not quite find what he longed for, the way to channel all his various talents toward a single goal. Instead, his mathematical gifts, in association with his philological bent, produced that weird blend of pedantry and wild imagination, the order of the ages, which occupied him for so many years. "It is fortunate you are not a historian," Jacobus commented. "You tend to let your own imagination run away with you. But I understand what you mean. I am myself a pedant only in my own discipline." It was a fruitful conversation, out of which sprang mutual understanding and a kind of friendship. It seemed to the Benedictine scholar more than coincidence, or at least a very special kind of coincidence, that the two of them, each operating within his own, Benedictine or Castalian, limitations, should have discovered this poor instructor at a Württemberg monastery, this man at once fine-strung and rock-hard, at once visionary and practical. Father Jacobus concluded that there must be something linking the two of them for the same unspectacular magnet to affect them both so powerfully. And from that evening on, which had begun with the Purcell Sonata, that link actually existed. Jacobus enjoyed the exchange of views with so well-trained, yet still so supple a young mind. This was a pleasure he did not often have. And Knecht found his association with the historian, and the education Jacobus provided, a new stage on the path of awakening, that path which he nowadays identified as his life. To put the matter succinctly, from Father Jacobus he learned history. He learned the laws and contradictions of historical studies and historiography. And beyond that, in the following years he learned to see the present and his own life as historical realities. Their talks often grew into regular disputations, with formal attacks and rebuttals. In the beginning it was Father Jacobus who proved to be the more aggressive of the pair. The more deeply he came to know his young friend's mind, the more he regretted that so promising a young man should have grown up without the discipline of a religious education, rather in the pseudo-discipline of an intellectual and aesthetic system of thought. Whenever he found something objectionable in Knecht's way of thinking, he blamed it on that modern Castalian spirit with its abstruseness and its fondness for frivolous abstractions. And whenever Knecht surprised him by wholesome views and remarks akin to his own thought, he exulted because his young friend's sound nature had so well withstood the damage of Castalian education. Joseph took this criticism of Castalia very calmly, repelling the attacks only when the old scholar seemed to him to have gone too far in his passion. But among the good father's belittling remarks about Castalia were some whose partial truth Joseph had to admit, and on one point he changed his mind completely during his stay in Mariafels. This had to do with the relationship of Castalian thought to world history, any sense of which, Father Jacobus said, was totally lacking in Castalia. "You mathematicians and glass bead game players," he would say, "have distilled a kind of world history to suit your own tastes. It consists of nothing but the history of ideas and of art. Your history is bloodless and lacking in reality. You know all about the decay of Latin syntax in the 2nd or 3rd centuries, and don't know a thing about Alexander or Caesar or Jesus Christ. You treat world history as a mathematician does mathematics, in which nothing but laws and formulas exist, no reality, no good and evil, no time, no yesterday, no tomorrow, nothing but an eternal, shallow mathematical present." "But how is anyone to study history without attempting to bring order into it?" Knecht asked. "Of course one should bring order into history," Jacobus thundered. "Every science is, among other things, a method of ordering, simplifying, making the indigestible digestible for the mind. We think we have recognized a few laws in history and try to apply them to our investigations of historical truth. Suppose an anatomist is dissecting a body. He does not confront wholly surprising discoveries. Rather, he finds beneath the epidermis congeries of organs, muscles, tendons, and bones, which generally conform to a pattern he has brought to his work. But if the anatomist sees nothing but his pattern, and ignores the unique individual reality of his object, then he is a Castalian, a glass bead game player. He is using mathematics on the least appropriate object. I have no quarrel with the student of history who brings to his work a touchingly childish, innocent faith in the power of our minds and our methods to order reality. But first and foremost, he must respect the incomprehensible truth, reality, and uniqueness of events. Studying history, my friend, is no joke and no irresponsible game. To study history, one must know in advance that one is attempting something fundamentally impossible, yet necessary and highly important. To study history means submitting to chaos and nevertheless retaining faith in order and meaning. It is a very serious task, young man, and possibly a tragic one." Among the remarks of Father Jacobus which Knecht at the time quoted in letters to his friends, here is one more characteristic outburst. "Great men are to youth like the raisins in the cake of world history. They are also part of its actual substance, of course, and it is not so simple and easy as might be thought to distinguish the really great men from the pseudo-greats. Among the latter, it is the historical moment itself, and their ability to foresee its coming and seize it, that gives them the semblance of greatness. Quite a few historians and biographers, to say nothing of journalists, consider this ability to divine and seize upon a historical moment, in other words, temporary success, as in itself a mark of greatness. The corporal who becomes a dictator overnight, or the courtesan who for a while controls the good or ill humor of a ruler of the world, are favorite figures of such historians. And idealistically minded youths, on the other hand, most love the tragic failures, the martyrs, those who came on the scene a moment too soon or too late. For me, since I am, after all, chiefly a historian of our Benedictine order, the most attractive and amazing aspects of history, and the most deserving of study, are not individuals and not coups, triumphs, or downfalls. Rather, I love and am insatiably curious about such phenomena as our congregation. For it is one of those long-lived congregations whose purpose is to gather, educate, and reshape men's minds and souls, to make a nobility of them, not by eugenics, not by blood, but by the spirit, the nobility as capable of serving as of ruling. In Greek history I was fascinated not by the galaxy of heroes, and not by the obtrusive shouting in the agora, but by efforts such as those of the Pythagorean Brotherhood or the Platonic Academy. In Chinese history, no other feature is so striking as the longevity of the Confucian system. And in our own Occidental history, the Christian Church and the orders which serve it as part of its structure seem to me historical elements of the foremost importance. The fact that an adventurer contrives to conquer or found a kingdom which lasts 20, 50, or even 100 years, or that a well-meaning idealist on a royal or imperial throne once in a while brings greater honesty into politics, or attempts to carry some visionary cultural project to fruition, that under high pressure a nation or other community has been capable of incredible feats of achievement and suffering, all that interests me far less than the ever-recurrent efforts to establish such organizations as our order, and that some of these efforts have endured for 1,000 or 2,000 years. I shall say nothing of Holy Church itself. For us believers it is beyond discussion, but that communities such as the Benedictines, the Dominicans, later the Jesuits and others have survived for centuries, and despite their ups and downs, the assaults upon them, and the adaptations they have made, retain their face and their voice, their gesture, their individual soul. This is, for me, the most remarkable and meritorious phenomenon in history. Knecht even admired Father Jacobus's spells of angry unfairness. At the time, however, he had no notion of who Father Jacobus really was. He regarded him solely as a profound and brilliant scholar, and was unaware that here was someone who was consciously participating in world history, and helping to shape it as the leading statesman of his order. As an expert in contemporary politics, as well as political history, Father Jacobus was constantly being approached from many sides for information, advice, and mediation. For some 2 years, up to the time of his first vacation, Knecht continued to think of Father Jacobus solely as a scholar, knowing no more of the man's life, activity, reputation, and influence than the monk cared to reveal. The learned father knew how to keep his counsel, even in friendship, and his brothers in the monastery were also far abler at concealment than Joseph would have imagined. After some 2 years, Knecht had adapted to the life in the monastery as perfectly as any guest and outsider could. From time to time he had helped the organist modestly continue the thin thread of an ancient and great tradition in the monastery's small chorus of motet singers. He had made several finds in the monastic musical archives, and had sent to Waldsell, and especially to Montport, several copies of old works. He had trained a small beginner's class of Glass Bead Game players, among whom the most zealous pupil was young Anton. He had taught Abbot Gervasius no Chinese, but had at least imparted the technique of manipulating the yarrow sticks and an improved method of meditating on the aphorisms in the Book of Oracles. The abbot had grown accustomed to him, and had long since stopped trying to coax his guest into taking an occasional glass of wine. The semi-annual reports sent by the abbot to the Glass Bead Game master, in reply to official inquiries as to the usefulness of Joseph Knecht, were full of praise. In Castalia, the lesson plans and marks in Knecht's game course were scrutinized even more closely than these reports. The middling level of instruction was recognized, but the Castalian authorities were satisfied with the way the teacher had adapted to this level, and, in general, to the customs and the spirit of the monastery. They were even more pleased, and truly surprised, although they kept this to themselves, by his frequent and friendly association with the famous Father Jacobus. This association had borne all sorts of fruits, and perhaps we may be permitted to say a word about these even at the cost of anticipating our story somewhat, or at any rate about the fruit which Knecht most prized. It ripened slowly, slowly, grew as tentatively and warily as the seeds of high mountain trees that have been planted down in the lush lowlands. These seeds, consigned to rich soil and a kindly climate, carry in themselves as their legacy the restraint and mistrust with which their forebears grew. The slow tempo of growth belongs among their hereditary traits. Thus, the prudent old man, accustomed to keep close watch over all possible influences upon him, permitted the element of Castalian spirit brought to him by his young friend and antipodal colleague to strike root only reluctantly and inch by inch. Gradually, however, it sprouted, and of all the good things that Knecht experienced in his years at the monastery, this was the best and most precious of all to him. This scanty, hesitant growth of trust and openness from seemingly hopeless beginnings on the part of the experienced older man, this slowly germinating and even more slowly admitted sympathy for his younger admirer as a person, and beyond that, for the specifically Castalian elements in his personality. Step by step, the younger man, seemingly little more than pupil, listener, and learner, led Father Jacobus, who initially had used the words Castalian and Glass Bead Game player only with ironic emphasis, and often as outright invective, toward a tolerant and ultimately respectful acceptance of this other mentality, this other order, this other attempt to create an aristocracy of the spirit. Father Jacobus ceased to carp at the youth of the order, though with its little more than 2 centuries the Benedictines were the elder by some 1,500 years. He ceased to regard the glass bead game as mere aesthetic dandyism, and he ceased to rule out the prospect of friendship and alliance between the two orders so ill-matched in age. Joseph regarded this partial conquest of Father Jacobus as a personal cause for rejoicing. He remained unaware that the authorities considered it the utmost of his accomplishments on his mission to Mariafels. Now and again he wondered in vain what was the real reason for his assignment to the monastery. Though initially it had seemed to be a promotion and distinction envied by his competitors, could it not signify a form of inglorious premature retirement, a relegation to a dead end? But then one could learn something everywhere, so why not here too? On the other hand, from the Castalian point of view, this monastery, Father Jacobus alone excepted, was certainly no garden of learning or model of scholarship. He wondered, too, whether his isolation among nothing but unexacting dilettantes was not already affecting his prowess in the glass bead game. He could not quite tell whether he was losing ground. For all his uncertainty, however, he was helped by his lack of ambition, as well as his already quite advanced amor fati. On the whole, his life as a guest and unimportant teacher in this cozy old monastic world was more to his liking than his last months at Waldsal as one of a circle of ambitious men. If fate wished to leave him forever in this small colonial post, he would certainly try to change some aspects of his life here. For example, contrive to bring one of his friends here, or at least ask for a longish leave in Castalia every year. But for the rest he would be content. The reader of this biographical sketch may possibly be waiting for an account of another side of Knecht's experience in the monastery, namely the religious side. But we can venture only some tentative hints. It is certainly likely that Knecht had some deeply felt encounter with religion, with Christianity as daily practiced in the monastery. In fact, from some of his later remarks and attitudes, it is quite clear that he did. But whether and to what extent he became a Christian is a question we must leave unanswered. These realms are closed to our researches. In addition to the respect for religions generally cultivated in Castalia, Knecht had a kind of inner reverence which we would scarcely be wrong to call pious. Moreover, he had already been well instructed in the schools on the classical forms of Christian doctrine, especially in connection with his studies of church music. Above all, he was well acquainted with the sacramental meaning and ritual of the Mass. With a good deal of astonishment as well as reverence, he had found among the Benedictines a living religion which he had hitherto known only theoretically and historically. He attended many services, and after he had familiarized himself with some of the writings of Father Jacobus, and taken to heart some of their talks, he became fully aware of how phenomenal this Christianity was, a religion that through the centuries had so many times become unmodern and outmoded, antiquated and rigid, but had repeatedly recalled the sources of its being, and thereby renewed itself, once again leaving behind those aspects which, in their time, had been modern and victorious. He did not seriously resist the idea, presented to him every so often in those talks, that perhaps Castalian culture was merely a secularized and transitory offshoot of Christian culture in its Occidental form, which would some day be reabsorbed by its parent. Even if that were so, he once remarked to Father Jacobus, his, Joseph Knecht's, own place lay within the Castalian and not the Benedictine system. He had to serve the former, not the latter, and prove himself within it. His task was to work for the system of which he was a member, without asking whether it could claim perpetual existence or even a long span of life. He could only regard conversion as a rather undignified form of escape, he said. In similar fashion, Johann Albrecht Bengel, whom they both venerated, had in his time served a small and transitory sect without neglecting his duties to the eternal. Piety, which is to say, faithful service and loyalty up to the point of sacrificing one's life, was part and parcel of every creed and every stage of individual development. Such service and loyalty were the only valid measure of devoutness. Knecht had been staying with the Benedictine fathers for some 2 years when a visitor appeared at the monastery who was kept apart from him with great care. Even a casual introduction was avoided. His curiosity roused by these procedures, he observed the stranger for the few days of his visit, and indulged in all sorts of speculations. He became convinced that the stranger's religious habit was a disguise. The unknown held long conferences behind closed doors with the abbot and Father Jacobus, and was always receiving and sending urgent messages. Knecht, who by now had at least heard rumors about the political connections and traditions of the monastery, guessed that the guest must be a high-ranking statesman on a secret mission, or a sovereign traveling incognito. As he reflected on the matter, he recalled several guests of the past few months whose visits, in hindsight, seemed to him equally mysterious or significant. Now he remembered the chief of the Castalian police, his friendly mentor Dubois, and the request that he keep an eye on such events in the monastery. And although he still felt neither the urge nor the vocation for making such reports, his conscience troubled him for having not written to the kindly man for so long a time. No doubt Dubois was disappointed in him. So he wrote him a long letter, tried to explain his silence, and in order to give some substance to his letter, said a few words about his association with Father Jacobus. He had no idea how carefully and by how many important persons his letter would be read back in Castalia. Chapter 5. The Mission. Knecht's first stay at the monastery lasted 2 years. At this time he was in his 37th year. One morning, some 2 months after his long letter to Dubois, he was called into the abbot's office. He expected the affable abbot would want to chat a bit about Chinese, and made his appearance promptly. Gervasius came forward to meet him, a letter in hand. "I have been honored with a commission for you, my esteemed friend," he said gaily in his amiably patronizing manner, and promptly dropped into the ironically teasing tone that had developed as an expression of the still unclarified amity between the religious and the Castalian orders, the tone that was actually a creation of Father Jacobus. "Incidentally, my respects to your Magister Ludi. What letters he writes! The honorable gentleman has written to me in Latin, heaven knows why. When you Castalians do something, one never knows whether you intend a courtesy or a mockery, an honor or a rap on the knuckles. At any rate, The venerable Dominus has written to me in the kind of Latin that no one in our whole order could manage at this time, except possibly Father Jacobus. It's a Latin that might have come directly out of the school of Cicero, but laced with a carefully measured dash of church Latin. And, of course, it's again impossible to tell whether that is intended naively as bait for us padres, or meant ironically, or simply springs from an irresistible impulse to play-act, stylize, and embellish. At any rate, His Honor writes that your esteemed authorities wish to see and embrace you once again, and also to determine to what extent your long stay among semi-barbarians like us has had a morally and stylistically corrupting effect upon you. In brief, if I have correctly interpreted the lengthy epistle, a leave has been granted you, and I have been requested to send my guest home to Waldsell for an indefinite term, but not forever. On the contrary, the authorities contemplate your returning by and by, if that seems agreeable to us. I must beg your pardon. I am scarcely capable of appreciating all the subtleties of the letter, nor do I imagine that Magister Thomas expected me to. I have been asked to transmit to you this notice, and now go and consider whether and when you wish to depart. We shall miss you, my friend, and if you should stay away too long, we shall not fail to demand your return." In the envelope the abbot had given him, Knecht found a terse notice from the board, informing him that a leave had been granted him both as a vacation and for consultation with his superiors, and that he was expected in Waldsell in the near future. He need not see the current game course for beginners through to the end, unless the abbot specifically asked him to. The former music master sent his regards. As he read that line, Joseph started and grew pensive. How had the writer of the letter, the Magister Ludi, been asked to pass on this greeting, which in any case did not really fit the official tone of the letter? There must have been a conference of the entire board, to which the former music master had been invited. Very well. The meetings and decisions of the Board of Educators did not concern him, but the tone of these greetings struck him as strange. The message sounded curiously as if it were directed to an equal. It did not matter what question had been discussed at the conference. The regards proved that the highest authorities had also talked about Joseph Knecht on that occasion. Was something new in the offing? Was he to be recalled? And would this be a promotion or a setback? But the letter spoke only of a leave. To be sure, he was eager for this leave. He would have gladly left the next day. But at least he must say goodbye to his pupils and leave instruction for them. Anton would be very saddened by his departure. And he also owed a farewell visit to some of the fathers. At this point he thought of Jacobus, and to his mild astonishment he felt a slight ache, an emotion which told him that his heart was more attached to Mariafels than he had realized. Here he lacked many of the things which he was used to, and which were dear to him, and in the course of the 2 years, distance and deprivation had made Castalia even more beautiful in his imagination. But at this moment he saw clearly that what Father Jacobus meant to him was irreplaceable, and that he would miss it in Castalia. At the same time he realized more clearly than ever how much he had learned in the monastery. Because of his experiences here, he looked forward with rejoicing and confidence to the journey to Waldsell, to reunions, to the Glass Bead Game, and his holiday. But his happiness would have been far less were it not for the prospect of returning. Coming to an abrupt resolution, he called on Father Jacobus. He told him of his recall, and of his surprise to find, underneath his pleasure at going home and seeing friends, a joyful anticipation of returning. This joy, he said respectfully, was chiefly connected with Father Jacobus himself. Therefore he had summoned up his courage, and was venturing to ask a great favor. When he returned, would Father Jacobus be his mentor, if only for an hour or 2 a week? Father Jacobus gave a deprecating laugh, and once more came forth with elegantly sardonic compliments. A simple monk could only gape in mute admiration and shake his head in wonder at the surpassing range of Castalian culture. But Joseph could gather that the refusal was not meant seriously, and as they shook hands in parting, Father Jacobus said amiably that he could rest easy about his request. He would gladly do what he could for him, and he bade Joseph goodbye with heartfelt warmth. Gladly, he set out for his vacation at home, already sure in his heart that his period in the monastery had not been profitless. At departure he felt like a boy, but he soon realized that he was no boy, and no longer a youth either. He realized that by the feelings of embarrassment and inner resistance that flooded him as soon as he tried, by a gesture, a shout, some childish act, to give vent to the mood of release and of schoolboy happiness at vacation time. No doubt about it, the things that once had been natural and a relief, a jubilant cry to the birds in a tree, a marching song chanted aloud, swinging along the road in a light rhythmical dance step, these would not do any more. They would have come out stiff and forced, would have been foolish and childish. He felt that he was a man, young in feelings and youthful in strength, but no longer used to surrendering to the mood of the moment, no longer free, instead kept on his mettle, tied down and duty-bound. By what? By an official post? By the task of representing his country and his order to the monks? No. Rather it was the order itself, the hierarchy. As he engaged in this sudden self-analysis, he realized that he had incomprehensibly grown into the hierarchy, become part of its structure. His constraint came from the responsibility, from belonging to the higher collectivity. This it was that made many young men old, and many old men appear young, that held you, supported you, and at the same time deprived you of your freedom like the stake to which a sapling is tied. This it was that took away your innocence, even while it demanded ever more limpid purity. In Montport he paid his respects to the former music master, who in his younger years had himself once been a guest at Mariafell's and studied Benedictine music there. He plied Joseph with many questions about the place. Joseph found the old man somewhat more subdued and withdrawn, but stronger and gayer in appearance than he had been at their last meeting. The fatigue had departed from his face. It was not that he had grown younger since resigning his office, but he definitely looked handsomer and more spiritualized. Knecht was struck by the fact that though he inquired about the organ, the chests of music manuscripts, and the choral singing in Mariafell's, and even wanted to hear whether the tree in the cloister garden was still standing, he seemed to have no curiosity about Knecht's work there, the Glass Bead Game course, or the purpose of his present leave. Before he continued his journey, however, the old man gave him a valuable hint. "I have heard," he said with seeming jocularity, "that you have become something of a diplomat. Not really a very nice occupation, but it seems our people are satisfied with you. Interpret that as you like. But if it doesn't happen to be your ambition to stay in this occupation forever, then be on your guard, Joseph. I think they want to capture you for it. Defend yourself. You have the right to. No, ask me no questions. I shall not say a word more. You will see." In spite of this warning, which he carried with him like a thorn in his flesh, Joseph felt something like rapture on returning to Waldsell. It was as if Waldsell were not only home and the most beautiful place in the world, but as if it had become even lovelier and more interesting in the meanwhile. Or else he was returning with fresh and keener eyes. And this applied not only to the gates, towers, trees, and river, to the courtyards and halls and familiar faces. During this furlough he felt a heightened receptivity to the spirit of Waldsell, to the order and the Glass Bead Game. It was the grateful understanding of the homecoming traveler, now grown matured and wiser. "I feel," he said to his friend Tegularius at the end of an enthusiastic eulogy on Waldsell and Castalia, I feel as if I spent all my years here asleep, happy enough to be sure, but unconscious. Now I feel awake, and see everything sharply and clearly, indubitable reality. To think that 2 years abroad can so sharpen one's vision. He enjoyed his vacation as if it were a prolonged festival. His greatest pleasure came from the games and discussions with his fellow members of the elite at the Vicus Lusorum, from seeing friends again, and from the genius loci of Waldsell. This soaring sense of happiness did not reach its peak, however, until after his first audience with the Glass Bead Game master. Up to then, his joy had been mingled with trepidation. The Magister Ludi asked fewer questions than Knecht had anticipated. He scarcely mentioned the game course for beginners and Joseph's studies in the music archives. On the other hand, he could not hear enough about Father Jacobus, referred back to him again and again, and was interested in every morsel Joseph could tell him about this man. From the Magister's great friendliness, Joseph concluded that they were satisfied with him and his mission among the Benedictines. Very satisfied indeed. His conclusion was confirmed by the conduct of Monsieur Dubois, to whom he was promptly sent by Magister Thomas. "You've done a splendid job," Dubois said. With a low laugh he added, "My instinct was certainly at fault when I advised against your being sent to the monastery. You're winning over the great Father Jacobus in addition to the abbot, and making him more favorable toward Castalia is a great deal, more than anyone dared to hope for." 2 days later, Magister Thomas invited Joseph, together with Dubois and the current head of the Waldsell elite school, Zbinden's successor, to dinner. During the conversation hour after dinner, the new music master unexpectedly turned up, as did the archivist of the order, 2 more members of the Supreme Board. One of them took Joseph along to the guest house for a lengthy talk. This invitation, for the first time, moved Knecht publicly into the most intimate circle of candidates for high office, and set up between himself and the average member of the game elite a barrier which Knecht, now keenly alert to such matters, at once felt acutely. For the present, he was given a vacation of 4 weeks, and the customary official's pass to the guest houses of the province. Although no duties were assigned him, and he was not even asked to report, it was evident that he was under observation by his superiors. For when he went on a few visits and outings, once to Keuperheim, once to Hirschland, and once to the College of Far Eastern Studies, invitations from the high officials in these places were immediately forthcoming. Within those few weeks he actually became acquainted with the entire board of the order, and with the majority of the masters and directors of studies. Had it not been for these highly official invitations and encounters, these outings would have betokened a return to the freedom of his years of study. He began to cut back on the visits, chiefly out of consideration for Tegularius, who was painfully sensitive to these infringements on their time together, but also for the sake of the Glass Bead Game, for he was very eager to participate in the newest exercises and to test himself on the latest problems. For this, Tegularius proved to be of invaluable assistance to him. His other close friend, Ferramonte, had joined the staff of the new music master, and Joseph was able to see him only twice during this period. He found him hard-working and happy in his work, engrossed in a major musicological task involving the persistence of Greek music in the dances and folk songs of the Balkan countries. Enthusiastically, Ferramonte told his friend about his latest discoveries. He had been exploring the era at the end of the 18th century, when Baroque music was beginning to decline and was taking in new materials from Slavic folk music. However, Knecht spent the greater part of these holidays in Waldsell occupied with the Glass Bead Game. With Fritz Tegularius, he went over the notes Fritz had taken on a private seminar the Magister had given for advanced players during the past 2 semesters. After his 2 years of deprivation, Knecht again plunged with all his energy into the noble world of the game, whose magic seemed to him as inseparable from his life and as indispensable to it as music. The last days of his vacation arrived before the Magister Ludi came around to mentioning Joseph's mission in Mariafels and his next task for the immediate future. He chatted casually at first, but soon changed to a more earnest and insistent tone as he told Joseph about a plan conceived by the board which the majority of the masters, as well as Monsieur Dubois, considered highly important. The plan to establish a permanent Castalian representative at the Holy See. The historic moment had come, Master Thomas explained in his engaging urbane manner, or at any rate was drawing near, for bridging the ancient gulf between Rome and the Order. In future dangers they would undoubtedly have common enemies, would share a common fate, and hence were natural allies. In the long run, the present state of affairs was untenable and, properly speaking, undignified. It would not do for the two powers, whose historic task in the world was to preserve and foster the things of the spirit and the cause of peace, to go on existing side by side almost as strangers to each other. The Roman Church had survived the shocks of the last great epoch of wars, had lived through the crises despite severe losses, and had emerged renewed and purified, whereas the secular centers of the arts and sciences had gone under in the general decline of culture. It was out of their ruins that the order and the Castalian ideal had arisen. For that very reason, and because of its venerable age, it was right and proper to grant the Church precedence. She was the older, more distinguished power, her worth tested in more and greater storms. For the present, the problem was to awaken the Roman Catholics to greater awareness of the kinship between the two powers and their dependence upon each other in all future crises. At this point, Knecht thought, "Oh, so they want to send me to Rome, possibly forever." Mindful of the former music master's warning, he inwardly put himself in a posture of defense. An important step forward, Master Thomas continued, had already been taken as a result of Knecht's mission in Mariafels. In itself, this mission had been only a polite gesture, imposing no obligations, and undertaken without ulterior motives, at the invitation of the others. Otherwise, of course, the board would not have sent a politically innocent Glass Bead Game player, but some younger official from Dubois' department. But as it turned out, this experiment, this innocuous mission, had had astonishing results. A leading mind of contemporary Catholicism, Father Jacobus, had been made acquainted with the spirit of Castalia, and had come to take a favorable view of that spirit, which he had hitherto flatly rejected. The authorities were grateful to Joseph Knecht for the part he had played. Here lay the significance of his mission. The further course of Knecht's work must be regarded in the light of it, since all future efforts at rapprochement would be built upon this success. He had been granted a vacation, which could be somewhat extended if he wished, and most of the members of the higher authorities had met and talked with him. His superiors had expressed their confidence in Knecht, and had now charged the Magister Ludi to send him on a special assignment, and with broader powers, back to Mariafels, where he was, happily, sure of a friendly reception. He paused, as if to allow time for a question, but Joseph only signified by a courteous gesture of submission that he was all attention and was awaiting his orders. "The assignment I have for you now," the Magister went on, "is the following. We are planning, sooner or later, to establish a permanent embassy of our order at the Vatican, if possible on a reciprocal basis. As the younger group, we are ready to adopt a highly deferential, though of course not servile, attitude toward Rome. We are quite willing to accept second place and allow Rome the first. Perhaps, I am no more sure of it than Dubois, the Pope would accept our offers straight away, but we cannot risk a rebuff. As it happens, there is a man within our reach whose voice has the greatest influence in Rome, Father Jacobus. And your assignment is to return to the Benedictine monastery, live there as you have already done, engage in studies, give an inconsequential course in the Glass Bead Game, and devote all your attention and care to slowly winning Father Jacobus over to our side and seeing to it that he promises to support our plans in Rome. In other words, this time the goal of your mission is precisely defined. It does not matter much how long you take to achieve it. We imagine that it will require at least a year, but it might also be 2 or several years. You are by now acquainted with the Benedictine tempo and have learned to adjust to it. Under no circumstances must we give the impression of being impatient or overeager. The affair must ripen of its own accord, right? I hope you agree to this assignment, and that you will frankly express any objections you may have. You may have a few days to think it over, if you like. Knecht, for whom the assignment was not such a surprise, thanks to some recent conversations, replied that he had no need to think it over. He obediently accepted, but added, "You know, sir, that missions of this kind are most successful when the emissary has no inner resistances and inhibitions to overcome. I have no reluctance about accepting. I understand the importance of the task and hope I can do justice to it. But I do feel a certain anxiety about my future. Be so kind, Magister, to hear me admit my entirely personal, egotistic concern. I am a Glass Bead Game player. As you know, due to my mission among the Benedictines, I have omitted my studies of the game for 2 full years. I have learned nothing new and have neglected my art. Now at least another year and probably more will be added. I should not like to fall still further behind during this time. Therefore, I would like to be allowed frequent brief leaves to visit Walsall and continual radio contact with the lectures and special exercises of your seminar for advanced players." "But of course," the master said. There was already a note of dismissal in his tone, but Knecht raised his voice and spoke of his other anxiety, that if his mission in Mariafell succeeded, he might be sent to Rome or employed otherwise for diplomatic work. Any such prospect, he concluded, would have a depressing effect upon me and hamper my efforts at the monastery, for I would not at all like to be permanently consigned to the diplomatic service. The Magister frowned and raised his finger chidingly. "You speak of being consigned. Really, the word is ill chosen. No one here ever thought of it as consigning, but rather as a distinction, a promotion. I am not authorized to give you any information or make any promises in regard to the way we shall be employing you in the future. But by a stretch of the imagination I can understand your doubts, and probably I shall be able to help you if your fears really prove to be justified. And now listen to me. You have a certain gift for making yourself agreeable and well-liked. An enemy might almost call you a charmer. Presumably this gift of yours prompted the board to make this second assignment to the monastery. But do not use your gift too freely, Joseph, and set no immoderate value on your achievements. If you succeed with Father Jacobus, that will be the proper moment for you to address a personal request to the board. Today it seems to me premature. Let me know when you are ready to leave." Joseph received these words in silence, laying more weight on the benevolence behind them than the patent reprimand. Soon thereafter he returned to Mariafels. There he found the security of a precisely defined task a great benefaction. Moreover, this task was important and honorable, and in one respect it coincided with his own deepest desires, to come as close as possible to Father Jacobus and to win his full friendship. At the monastery he was evidently taken seriously as an envoy now, and was thought to have been raised in rank. The conduct of the dignitaries of the abbey, especially Abbot Gervasius himself, made that plain to him. They were as friendly as ever, but a discernible degree more respectful than before. They no longer treated Joseph as a young guest of no standing, toward whom they showed civility for the sake of his origins, and out of benevolence toward him personally. He was now received as a high-ranking Castalian official, given the deference due to an ambassador plenipotentiary. No longer blind in these matters, Joseph drew his own conclusions. Nevertheless, he could discover no change in Father Jacobus's attitude toward him. The old scholar greeted him with friendliness and pleasure. Without waiting to be asked or reminded, he himself brought up the matter of their working together. Joseph was deeply touched. He rearranged his schedule. His daily routine was now very different from what it had been before his vacation. This time, the Glass Bead Game course no longer formed the center of his work and duties. He gave up his studies in the music archives and his friendly collaboration with the organist. Now his chief concern was the instruction he received from Father Jacobus, lessons in several branches of historical science. The monk introduced his special pupil to the background and early history of the Benedictine order and to the sources for the early Middle Ages. He set aside a special hour in which they would read together one of the old chroniclers in the original. Father Jacobus was not displeased when Knecht pleaded to have young Anton participate in the lessons, but he had little difficulty persuading Joseph that even the best-intentioned third party could prove a serious hindrance to this kind of intensely private instruction. In consequence, Anton, who knew nothing of Knecht's efforts on his behalf, was invited to take part only in the readings of the chronicler, and was overjoyed. Undoubtedly, these lessons constituted a distinction for the young monk, concerning whose life we have no further information. They must have been a supreme pleasure and stimulus, for he was being allowed to share in the work and intellectual exchange of two of the purest and most original minds of his age. Share, however, is perhaps an exaggeration. For the most part, the young recruit merely listened. Joseph repaid Father Jacobus by giving him an introduction to the history and structure of Castalia and the main ideas underlying the Glass Bead Game. This instruction followed immediately after his own lessons in epigraphy and source work, the pupil becoming the teacher, and the honored teacher an attentive listener and often a captious critic and questioner. For a long while the Reverend Father continued to hold the whole Castalian mentality in distrust. Because he saw no real religious attitude in it, he doubted its capacity to rear the kind of human being he could take seriously, despite the fact that Knecht himself represented so fine a product of Castalian education. Even long after he had undergone a kind of conversion, insofar as that was possible, through Knecht's teaching and example, and was prepared to recommend the rapprochement of Castalia to Rome, this distrust never entirely died. Knecht's notes are full of striking examples of it, jotted down at the moment. We shall quote from one of them. Father Jacobus: "You are great scholars and aesthetes, you Castalians. You measure the weight of the vowels in an old poem and relate the resulting formula to that of a planet's orbit. That is delightful, but it is a game. And indeed, your supreme mystery and symbol, the Glass Bead Game, is also a game. I grant that you try to exalt this pretty game into something akin to a sacrament, or at least to a device for edification, but sacraments do not spring from such endeavors. The game remains a game." Joseph: "You mean, Reverend Father, that we lack the foundation of theology?" Father Jacobus: "Come now, of theology we will not speak. You are much too far from that. You could at least do with a few simpler foundations, with a science of man, for example, a real doctrine and real knowledge about the human race. You do not know man, do not understand him in his bestiality and as the image of God. All you know is the Castalian, a special product, a caste, a rare experiment in breeding." For Knecht, of course, it was an extraordinary piece of good fortune that these hours of instruction and discourse provided him with the widest field and the most favorable opportunities to carry out his assignment of gaining Father Jacobus's approval of Castalia and convincing him of the value of an alliance. The situation, in fact, was so favorable to his purposes that he soon began to feel twinges of conscience. He came to think it shameful and unworthy when they sat together or strolled back and forth in the cloisters, that the reverend man should be so trustfully sacrificing his time, when he was all the while the object of secret political designs. Knecht could not have accepted this situation in silence for long, and he was already considering just how to make his disclosure when, to his surprise, the old man anticipated him. "My dear friend," he said to him with seeming offhandedness one day, "we have really found our way to a most pleasant and, I would hope, also a fruitful kind of exchange. The two activities that have been my favorites throughout my life, learning and teaching, have fused into a fine new combination during our joint working sessions, and for me that has come at just the right time, for I am beginning to age, and cannot imagine any better cure and refreshment than our lessons. As far as I am concerned, therefore, I am the one who gains from our exchange. On the other hand, I am not so sure, my friend, that you, and particularly those whose envoy you are, and whom you serve, will have profited from the business as much as they may hope. I should like to avert any future disappointment, and would be sorry to have any unclear relationship arise between us. Therefore, permit an old hand a question. I have, of course, had occasion to think about the reason for your sojourn in our little abbey, pleasant as it is for me. Until recently, that is, up to the time of your vacation, it seemed to me that the purpose of your presence among us was not completely clear even to yourself. Was my observation correct?" "It was." "Good. Since your return from that vacation, this has changed. You are no longer puzzling or anxious about the reason for your presence here. You know why you are here, am I right? Good, then I have not guessed wrong. Presumably, I am also not guessing wrong in my notion of the reason. You have a diplomatic assignment, and it concerns neither our monastery nor our abbot, but me. As you see, not very much is left of your secret. To clarify the situation completely, I shall take the final step and ask you to inform me fully about the rest of it. What is your assignment?" Knecht had sprung to his feet and stood facing Father Jacobus, surprised, embarrassed, feeling something close to dismay. "You are right," he cried. "But at the same time that you relieve me of a burden, you also shame me by speaking first. I have long been considering how I could manage to give our relationship the clarity you have established so rapidly. The one saving thing is that my request for instruction and our agreement fell in the period before my vacation. Otherwise, it truly would have seemed as if the whole thing had been diplomacy on my part, and our studies merely a pretext." The old man spoke with friendly reassurance. "I merely wanted to help both of us move forward a step. There is no need for you to aver the purity of your motives. If I have anticipated you and helped speed the coming of something that also seems desirable to you, all is well." After Knecht had told him the nature of his assignment, he commented, "Your superiors in Castalia are not exactly brilliant diplomats, but they are not so bad either, and they know a good thing when they see it. I shall give all the consideration to your mission, and my decision will depend partly on how well you can explain your Castalian constitution and ideals, and make them seem plausible to me. Let us give ourselves all the time we need for that." Seeing that Knecht still looked somewhat crestfallen, he gave a brittle laugh and said, "If you like, you can also regard my proceeding thus as a kind of lesson. We are two diplomats, and diplomats' intercourse is always a combat, no matter how friendly a form it may take. In our struggle, as it happens, I was momentarily at a disadvantage. I had lost the initiative. You knew more than I. Now the balance has been restored. The chess move was successful, therefore it was the right one." Knecht thought it important to win Father Jacobus's approval for the Castalian authorities' project, but it seemed to him far more important to learn as much as possible from him, and for his own part to serve this learned and powerful man as a reliable guide to the Castalian world. A good many of Knecht's friends and later disciples envied him, as remarkable men are always envied, not only for their greatness of soul and energy, but also for their seeming luck, their seeming preferment by destiny. The lesser man sees in the greater as much as he can see, and Joseph Knecht's career cannot help striking every observer as unusually brilliant, rapid, and seemingly effortless. Certainly we are tempted to say of that period in his life, he was lucky. Nor would we wish to try to explain this luck rationalistically or moralistically, either as the casual result of external circumstances or as a kind of reward for special virtue. Luck has nothing to do with rationality or morality. By its nature, it has about it a quality akin to magic, belonging to a primitive, more youthful stage of mankind's history. The lucky innocent, showered with gifts by the fairies, pampered by the gods, is not the object of rational study, and hence not a fit subject for biographical analysis. He is a symbol who always stands outside the personal and historical realms. Nevertheless, there are outstanding men with whose lives luck is intimately bound up, even though that luck may consist merely in the fact that they and the task proper to their talents actually intersect on the plane of history and biography, that they are born neither too soon nor too late. Knecht seems to have been one of these. Thus his life, at least for a considerable part of his way, gives the impression that everything desirable simply fell into his lap. We do not wish to deny or to gloss over this aspect of his life. Moreover, we could explain it rationally only by a biographical method which is not ours, neither desired nor permitted in Castalia. That is, we would have to enter into an almost unlimited discussion of the most personal, most private matters, of health and sickness, the oscillations and curves in his vitality and self-confidence. We are quite sure that any such biographical approach, which is out of the question for us, would reveal a perfect balance between Knecht's luck and his suffering, but nevertheless would falsify our portrayal of his person and his life. But enough digression. We were saying that many of those who knew Knecht, or had only heard of him, envied him. Probably few things in his life seemed to lesser folk so enviable as his relationship to the old Benedictine father, for he was at one and the same time pupil and teacher, taker and giver, conquered and conqueror, friend and collaborator. Moreover, none of Knecht's conquests since his successful courting of elder brother in the bamboo grove had given him such happiness. No other had made him feel so intensely honored and abashed, rewarded and stimulated. Of his later favorite pupils, almost all have testified to how frequently, gladly, and joyfully he would refer to Father Jacobus. Knecht learned from the Benedictine something he could scarcely have learned in the Castalia of those days. He acquired an overview of the methods of historical knowledge and the tools of historical research, and had his first practice in applying them. But far beyond that, he experienced history not as an intellectual discipline, but as reality, as life, and in keeping with that, the transformation and elevation of his own personal life into history. This was something he could not have learned from a mere scholar. Father Jacobus was not only far more than a scholar, a seer and a sage, he was also a mover and shaper. He had used the position in which fate had placed him, not just to warm himself at the cozy fires of a contemplative existence. He had allowed the winds of the world to blow through his scholar's den and admitted the perils and forebodings of the age into his heart. He had taken action, had shared the blame and the responsibility for the events of his time. He had not contented himself with surveying, arranging, and interpreting the happenings of the distant past. And he had not dealt only with ideas, but with the refractoriness of matter and the obstinacy of men. Together with his associate and antagonist, a recently deceased Jesuit, He was regarded as the real architect of the diplomatic and moral power and the impressive political prestige that the Roman Church had regained after ages of meekly borne ineffectuality and insignificance. Although teacher and pupil scarcely ever discussed current politics, the Benedictine's practice in holding his counsel, as well as the younger man's reluctance to be drawn into such issues, combined to prevent that. Father Jacobus's political position and activities so permeated his mind that all his opinions, all of his glances into the thicket of the world's squabbles, were those of the practical statesman. Not that he was an ambitious or an intriguing politician. He was no regent and leader, no climber either, but a counselor and arbitrator, a man whose conduct was tempered by sagacity, whose efforts were restrained by a profound insight into the inadequacies and difficulties of human nature, but whose fame, experience, knowledge of men and conditions, as well as his personal integrity and altruism, had enabled him to gain significant power. Knecht had known nothing of all this when he came to Mariafels. He had even been ignorant of Father Jacobus's name. The majority of the inhabitants of Castalia lived in a state of political innocence and naivete, such as had been quite common among the professors of earlier ages. They had no political rights and duties, scarcely ever saw a newspaper. Such was the habit of the average Castalian, such his attitude. Repugnance for current events, politics, newspapers, was even greater among the Glass Bead Game players, who liked to think of themselves as the real elite, the cream of the province, and went to some lengths not to let anything cloud the rarefied atmosphere of their scholarly and artistic existences. As we have seen, at the time of his first appearance at the monastery, Knecht had come not as a diplomatic envoy, but solely as a teacher of the Glass Bead Game, and had no political knowledge aside from what Monsieur Dubois had managed to instill in a few weeks. He was by comparison much more knowing now, but he had by no means surrendered the vault-seller's distaste for engaging in current politics. Although his association with Father Jacobus had awakened him politically and taught him a good deal, this had not happened because Knecht was drawn to this realm. It just happened, as an inevitable, though incidental, consequence. In order to add to his equipment, and the better to fulfill his honorable task of lecturing De Rebus Castaliensibus to his pupil, Father Jacobus, Knecht had brought with him from Walsall literature on the constitution and history of the province, on the system of the elite schools, and on the evolution of the Glass Bead Game. Some of these books had served him 20 years before, during his struggle with Plinio de Signori, and he had not looked at them since. Others, meant specially for the officials of Castalia, had been barred to him as a student. Now he read them for the first time. The result was that at the very time his areas of study were so notably expanding, he was also forced once again to contemplate, understand, and reinforce his own intellectual and historical base. In his efforts to present the nature of the order and of the Castalian system to Father Jacobus with maximum simplicity and clarity, he inevitably stumbled over the weakest point in his own and all Castalian education. He found that he himself had only a pale and rigidly schematic notion of the historical conditions which had led to the foundation of the order and everything that followed from it. His picture of the conditions which had furthered the growth of the new system lacked all vividness and orderliness. Since Father Jacobus was anything but a passive pupil, the result was an intensified collaboration, an extremely animated exchange of views. While Joseph tried to present the history of his Castalian order, Jacobus helped him to see many aspects of this history in the proper light for the first time, and to discern its roots in the general history of nations. Because of the Benedictine's temperament, these discussions often turned into passionate disputes. And as we shall see, they continued to bear fruit years later, and remained a vital influence down to the end of Knecht's life. On the other hand, The close attention Father Jacobus had given Knecht's exposition, and the thoroughness with which he came to know and appreciate Castalia, was evidenced by his subsequent conduct. Due to the work of these two men, there arose between Rome and Castalia a benevolent neutrality, and occasional scholarly exchange, which now and then developed into actual cooperation and alliance, and ultimately produced the concord which continues to this day. In time, Father Jacobus asked to be introduced to the theory of the Glass Bead Game, which he had originally pooh-poohed, for he sensed that here lay the secret of the order, and what might be called its faith or religion. Once he had consented to penetrate into this world he had hitherto known only from hearsay, and for which he had felt little liking, he resolutely proceeded in his shrewd and energetic way straight toward its center. And although he did not become a glass bead game player, he was in any case far too old for that, the devotees of the game and the order outside the borders of Castalia had hardly a friend as earnest and as influential as the great Benedictine. Now and then, after a session of joint work, Father Jacobus would indicate that he would be at home to Joseph that evening. After the strenuous lessons and the tense discussions, those were peaceful hours. Joseph frequently brought his clavichord along, or a violin, and the old man would sit down at the piano in the gentle light of a candle whose sweet fragrance of wax filled the small room, like the music of Corelli, Scarlatti, Telemann, or Bach, which they played alternately or together. The old man's bedtime came early, while Knecht, refreshed by these brief musical vespers, would continue his studies into the night, to the limits his self-discipline permitted. Aside from his lessons with Father Jacobus, his perfunctory course in the game, and an occasional Chinese colloquium with Abbot Gervasius, we also find Knecht engaged at this time in an elaborate task. He was taking part in the annual competition of the Waldsell elite, from which he had abstained in the past 2 years. The competition involved working out sketches for games based on 3 or 4 prescribed main themes. Stress was placed on new, bold, and original associations of themes, impeccable logic, and beautiful calligraphy. Moreover, this was the sole occasion when competitors were permitted to overstep the bounds of the canon. That is, they could employ new symbols not yet admitted to the official code and vocabulary of hieroglyphs. This made the competition, which in any case was the most exciting annual event in Waldsell, except for the great public ceremonial games, a contest among the most promising advocates of new game symbols, and the very highest distinction for a winner in this competition consisted in the recognition of his proposed additions to the grammar and vocabulary of the game, and their acceptance into the game archives and the game language. This was a very rare distinction indeed. Usually the winner had to be content only with the ceremonial performance of his game as the best candidate's game of the year. Once, some 25 years ago, the great Thomas von der Trave, the present Magister Ludi, had been awarded this honor with his new abbreviations for the alchemical significance of the signs of the zodiac. Later, too, Magister Thomas made large contributions to the study and classification of alchemy as a highly meaningful secret language. For his entry, Knecht chose not to draw on any new game symbols such as virtually every candidate had in readiness. He also refrained from using his game as an avowal of attachment to the psychological method of game construction, although that would have been closer to his inclinations. Instead, he built up a game modern and personal enough in its structure and themes, but of transparently clear, classical composition and strictly symmetrical development in the vein of the old masters. Perhaps distance from Waldsell and the game archives forced him to take this line. Perhaps his historical studies made too great demands on his time and strength. But it may also be that he was more or less consciously guided by the desire to shape his game so that it would correspond as closely as possible to the taste of his teacher and friend, Father Jacobus. We do not know. We have used the phrase psychological method of game construction, and perhaps some of our readers will not immediately understand it. In Knecht's day, it was a slogan bandied about a good deal. No doubt all periods have seen currents, vogues, struggles, and differing views and approaches among the initiates of the glass bead game. At that time, two opposing concepts of the game called forth controversy and discussion. The foremost players distinguished two principal types of game, the formal and the psychological. We know that Knecht, like Tegelarius, although the latter kept out of the arguments, belonged to the champions of the latter type. Knecht, however, instead of speaking of the psychological mode of play, usually preferred the word pedagogical. In the formal game, the player sought to compose out of the objective content of every game, out of the mathematical, linguistic, musical, and other elements, as dense, coherent, and formally perfect a unity and harmony as possible. In the psychological game, on the other hand, the object was to create unity and harmony, cosmic roundedness and perfection, not so much in the choice, arrangement, interweaving, association, and contrast of the contents, as in the meditation which followed every stage of the game. All the stress was placed on this meditation. Such a psychological, or to use Knecht's word, pedagogical, game did not display perfection to the outward eye. Rather, it guided the player, by means of its succession of precisely prescribed meditations, toward experiencing perfection and divinity. "The game, as I conceive it," Knecht once wrote to the former music master, "encompasses the player after the completion of meditation as the surface of a sphere encompasses its center, and leaves him with the feeling that he has extracted from the universe of accident and confusion a totally symmetrical and harmonious cosmos, and absorbed it into himself." Knecht's entry, then, was a formally, rather than a psychologically constructed game. Possibly he wanted to prove to his superiors, and to himself as well, that in spite of his elementary course and diplomatic mission in Mariafels, he had lost none of his deftness, elegance, and virtuosity, and had not suffered from lack of practice. If so, he succeeded in proving it. Since the final elaboration and clean copy of his game outline could only be completed in the Waldsal archives, he entrusted this task to his friend Tegelarius, who was himself participating in the competition. Joseph was able to hand his drafts to his friend personally, and to discuss them with him, as well as to go over Tegelarius's own outline, for Fritz was finally able to come to the monastery for 3 days. Magister Thomas had at last authorized the visit, after Knecht had made 2 previous requests in vain. Eager as Tegelarius had been to come, and for all the curiosity he, as an insular Castalian, had about life in the monastery, he felt extremely uncomfortable there. Sensitive as he was, he nearly fell ill amid all the alien impressions, and among these friendly but simple, healthy, and somewhat rough-hewn people, not one of whom would have had the slightest understanding for his thoughts, cares, and problems. "You live here as if you were on another planet," he said to his friend, "and I don't see how you have been able to stand it for 3 years. I certainly admire you for that. To be sure, your fathers are polite enough toward me, but I feel rejected and repelled by everything here. Nothing meets me halfway. Nothing is natural and easy. Nothing can be assimilated without resistance and pain. If I had to live here for 2 weeks, I would feel as if I were in hell." Knecht had a difficult time with him. Moreover, it was disconcerting to witness, for the first time as an onlooker, how alien the 2 orders, the 2 worlds, were to one another. He felt, too, that his oversensitive friend, with his air of anxious helplessness, was not making a good impression among the monks. Nevertheless, they revised their respective game plans for the competition thoroughly, each critically examining the other's work. When, after an hour of this, Knecht went over to Father Jacobus in the other wing, or to a meal, he had the feeling that he was being suddenly transported from his native country to an entirely different land, with a different soil and air, different climate, and different stars. After Fritz had departed, Joseph drew out Father Jacobus on his impressions. "I hope," Jacobus said, "that the majority of Castalians are more like you than your friend. You have shown us an inexperienced, overbred, weakly, and nevertheless, I'm afraid, arrogant kind of person. I shall go on taking you as more representative. Otherwise, I should certainly be unjust to your kind. For this unfortunate, sensitive, over-intelligent, fidgety person could spoil one's respect for your whole province." "Well," Knecht replied, "I imagine that in the course of the centuries you noble Benedictines have now and then had sickly, physically feeble, but for that very reason mentally sound and able men, such as my friend. I suppose it was imprudent of me to have invited him here, where everyone has a sharp eye for his weaknesses, but no sense of his great virtues. He has done me a great kindness by coming." And he explained to Father Jacobus about his joining in the competition. The Benedictine was pleased with Knecht for defending his friend. "Well answered," he said with a friendly laugh. "But it strikes me that all of your friends are difficult to get along with." He enjoyed Knecht's bewilderment and astonished expression for a moment, then added casually, "This time I am referring to someone outside Castalia. Have you heard anything new about your friend Plinio de Signori?" Joseph's astonishment increased. Stunned, he asked for an explanation. It seemed that de Signori had written a political polemic professing violently anti-clerical views, and incidentally strongly attacking Father Jacobus. Through friends in the Catholic press, Jacobus had obtained information on de Signori, and in this way had learned of Plinio's school days in Castalia and his relationship to Knecht. Joseph asked to borrow Plinio's article, and after he had read it, he and Father Jacobus had their first discussion of current politics. A few more, but only a few, followed. "It was strange and almost alarming," Joseph wrote to Ferramonte, "for me to see the figure of our Plinio, and by my own, suddenly standing on the stage of the world's politics. This was something I had never imagined." As it turned out, Father Jacobus spoke of Plinio's polemic in rather appreciative terms. At any rate, he showed no sign of having taken offense. He praised de Signori's style, commenting that his training in the elite school showed up clearly. In the run of everyday politics, one had to settle for a far lower level of intelligence, he said. About this time, Ferramonte sent Knecht a copy of the first part of his subsequently famous work entitled The Reception and Absorption of Slavic Folk Music by German Art Music from Joseph Haydn on. In Knecht's letter of acknowledgment we find, among other things, "You have drawn a cogent conclusion from your studies, which I was privileged to share for a while. The 2 chapters dealing with Schubert, and especially with the quartets, are among the soundest examples of modern musicology that I have read. Think of me sometimes. I am very far from any such harvest as you have reaped. Although I have reason to be content with my life here, for my mission in Mariafels appears to be meeting with some success, I do occasionally feel that being so far from the province and the Waldsell circle to which I belong is distinctly oppressive. I am learning a tremendous amount here, but adding neither to my certainties nor my professional skills, only to my problems. I must grant, though, a widening of horizon. However, I now feel much easier about the insecurity, strangeness, despondency, distraitness, self-doubt, and other ills that frequently assailed me during my first 2 years here. Tegularius was here recently, for only 3 days, but much as he had looked forward to seeing me, and curious though he was about Mariafels, by the 2nd day he could scarcely bear it any longer, so depressed and out of place did he feel. Since a monastery is after all a rather sheltered, peaceful world, and favorable enough to things of the spirit, in no way like a jail, a barracks, or a factory, I conclude from my experience that people from our dear province are a good deal more pampered and oversensitive than we realize. At about the date of this letter to Carlo, Knecht persuaded Father Jacobus to address a brief letter to the directorate of the Castalian order, acquiescing in the proposed diplomatic step. To this, Jacobus added the request that they would permit the Glass Bead Game player Joseph Knecht, who is universally popular here, and who is kindly giving him a private course, De Rebus Castaliensibus, to remain for a while longer. The Castalian authorities were, of course, glad to oblige. Joseph, who had been thinking that he was still very far from any such harvest, received a commendation, signed by the Directorate and by Monsieur Dubois, congratulating him on the success of his mission. But what struck him as most important about this honorific document, and what gave him the greatest pleasure, he reported it in well-nigh triumphant tones in a note to Fritz, was a short sentence to the effect that the order had been informed by the Magister Ludi of his desire to return to the Vicus Lusorum, and was disposed to grant this request after completion of his present assignment. Joseph also read this passage aloud to Father Jacobus, and now confessed how greatly he had feared possible permanent banishment from Castalia and being sent to Rome. Laughing, Father Jacobus commented, "Yes, my friend, there is something about orders. One prefers living in their bosom rather than out on the periphery, let alone in exile. You've touched the soiled fringes of politics here, but now go right ahead and forget it, for you are not a politician. But do not break your troth with history, even though it may remain forever a secondary subject and a hobby for you had the makings of a historian. And now let us profit by our time together as long as I have you." Joseph Knecht seems to have made little use of his privilege to pay more frequent visits to Waldsell. However, he listened on the radio to one seminar and to a good many lectures and games. So also, from afar, sitting in his excellent guest-room in the monastery, he took part in that solemnity in the festival hall of the Vicus Lusorum, at which the results of the prize competition were announced. He had handed in a rather impersonal and not at all revolutionary, but solid and elegant piece of work, whose value he knew, and he was prepared for an honorable mention or a third or second prize. To his surprise, he now heard that he had been awarded first prize, and even before surprise had given way to delight, the spokesman for the Magister Ludi's office continued reading in his beautiful low voice, and named Tegularius as winner of the second prize. It was certainly a moving and rapturous experience that the two of them should emerge from this competition hand in hand as the crowned winners. He sprang to his feet without listening to the rest, and ran down the stairs and through the echoing corridors out into the open air. In a letter to the former music master, written at this time, we may read, "I am very happy, revered master, as you can imagine. First, the success of my mission and its commendation by the directorate of the order, together with the prospect, so important to me, of soon returning home to friends and to the Glass Bead Game, instead of being kept in the diplomatic service, and now this first prize for a game whose formal aspects I did take pains with, but which for good reasons by no means drained me of everything I had to contribute. And on top of that, the joy of sharing this success with my friend. It really was too much all at once. I am happy, yes, but I could not well say that I am merry. Because of the dearth of the preceding period, at any rate what seemed to me a dearth, my real feeling is that these fulfillments are coming rather too suddenly and too abundantly. There is a measure of unease mingled with my gratitude, as if the vessel is so filled to the brim that only another drop is needed to tilt it. But please, consider that I have not said this. In this situation, every word is already too much. As we shall see, the vessel filled to the brim was destined to have more than just one additional drop added to it. But at the moment Joseph Knecht devoted himself to his happiness and the concomitant unease with great intensity, as if he had a premonition of the impending great change. For Father Jacobus, too, these few months were a happy and exuberant time. He was sorry that he would soon be losing this disciple and associate, and in their hours of work together, still more in their free-ranging conversations, he tried to bequeath to him as much as he could of the understanding he had acquired during a long life of hard work and hard thinking, understanding of the heights and depths in the lives of men and nations. He also had some things to say about the consequences of Knecht's mission, assessing its meaning and the value of amity and political concord between Rome and Castalia. He recommended that Joseph study the epoch which had seen the founding of the Castalian order, as well as the gradual recovery of Rome after a humiliating time of tribulation. He also recommended 2 books on the Reformation and Schism of the 16th century, but strongly urged him to make a principle of studying the primary sources. He advised Joseph to confine himself to graspable segments of a field, in preference to reading ponderous tomes on world history. Finally, Father Jacobus made no bones about his profound mistrust of all philosophies of history.